and I hope we're all going to have an interesting, if not entirely enjoyable evening. Thank you very much.
Good evening, and thank you so much for your kind welcome. Because of the logistics here, I hope you don't mind if I just sit down here and conduct the rest of it from this position. Is that going to be okay? Thank you so much. This is a lecture of some length. I'm going to take my watch off here, but I believe there's a calendar over there on the wall that I can see, so I'll try not to go too far. And as you see, my topic is 400 years of false flags, deceptions, and counter-gangs. And of course, it's Guy Fawkes, so what could be better than this? I'm on a kind of a European tour. I'm going to be in 5 or 6 places in Britain. I'm going to be in 5 or 6 in Italy, and then Paris at the end. And I'm doing this because of the strategic emergency. And what I'm trying to do is to do something about the gullibility of world public opinion vis-a-vis false flag operations, because I think that is the greatest strategic menace right now, that the Cheney faction in the United States is going to stage a new false flag, that is a new 9/11, an encore. Who is so gross that cannot see this palpable device? Yet who is so bold that says he sees it not? And I think that's our situation. We've got to learn not to believe in false flag, not to be hoodwinked, not to be suckers, not to be dupes, not to be credulous, but rather to bring to it a tremendous critical faculty based on historical experience. Now, what I recommend, actually, is buying and reading my books. This is 9/11 Synthetic Terror Made in USA, first edition 2005. I believe we're up to the 4th edition, which we have in the back. Next week in Italy, I'm doing book tour. La Fabbrica del Terrore, translation of that, has just appeared to actually surprisingly good reviews. And I hope to do something on that front. The Paris edition came out about a year ago, La Terreur Fabriquée. And I also have written in the past for the 1992 election campaign, George Bush, the Unauthorized Biography. And I had a couple of those. They're sold, but maybe somebody else has some to sell. This is the one that starts with Prescott Bush supporting Hitler. That entire complex comes from this book and really nowhere else. And as was mentioned, in 1978 I was asked by a member of the Italian government to write something about the kidnap and murder of Aldo Moro, the former prime minister. And you see the British flag, please don't be offended. The point of this was to say that he was kidnapped and murdered by NATO intelligence. And we would have put the US flag, but in Italy this is such a cliche, nobody would have noticed. We would have put the NATO flag, but nobody knows what that is either. So we said, let's put the British, and they'll get the idea. And I think some of them did. Surviving the Cataclysm is about the world currency and banking crisis right now. Maybe we can discuss it at the end. We're in the middle of the death agony of the US dollar. We're in the middle of the breakdown of the entire banking system. You've had Northern Rock, Countrywide Bank in the U.S. Right now, Citibank and Barclays Bank seem to be the next to take the plunge. And then Against Oligarchy, which is a kind of a phantom book. It used to exist on the internet, but it is slightly scattered. You can still find most of it. And I'm going to put out a new edition as soon as my Ford Foundation grant comes in, which may be a while. Now, thanks to these laborers, I guess I'm not totally obscure, as was mentioned. I have been on Fox News and CNN and the rest of these things. But, and of course, normally when you go on this program, one of them is for you and one of them is against you. But when I went on, they were both against you. They were never more hysterical than the night that I was on. But let's get to the deeper point of who I am. I have to ask for your patience and forbearance tonight, because I have to tell you a lot of things. They're very bad for the Venetians. I don't think that's going to upset too many people. But then after that, there's a phase that's very bad for the British, and that's where I'm afraid. But then I hope I can bring you back, because the phase after that is very bad for the U.S. And so who am I, right? Am I just yet another arrogant, loudmouth American coming over here, lecturing you about your own history, hectoring you, and so forth? Well, maybe I am that. But I hope I can also show you that I'm something else and a bit more broad. My grandmother came from Leeds, and my grandfather came from Wakefield. He was a bricklayer, an English skilled worker, which I thought was a fine thing to be. He was not the vicar of Wakefield, he was the bricker of Wakefield. And from them, I learned everything. When we talk about Guy Fawkes, I have received a formation in Guy Fawkes, second to none. I doubt there's anybody here who's heard more about Guy Fawkes from his grandmother than me, and this is how I grew up. And I heard all about Henry VIII eating off the plate, and the princes in the tower, and every week we'd get the Yorkshire Post and the news of the world, which was a very important experience for me to get the news of the world. So think of me as a representative of the Northern School, of the Yorkshire School, and that is to say, of a current inside the English-speaking world, which is very skeptical about the court, the City of London, the Foreign Office, and the Bank of England. Because I'll manage to attack all of those. I think I see a fellow Northerner there in the back. Now, all kidding aside, the main issue right now is the question of World War III, and in particular, the transition from Middle East regional war to a world war. Now, when I made this slide, not many people were saying World War, but now Bush has said World War III. So this, of course, is the issue. And let's see if we can get into a position to be able to say a few things. You can see the war in Iraq, which is already going on. The big goal right now is to attack Iran. And this is the goal of the entire Cheney faction. Please bear with me. When I say Cheney, I don't mean this alcoholic individual who's had 4 heart attacks, 5 pacemakers, a quadruple bypass, and all the rest. I'm referring to a faction, his controllers, his backers, his office, and so forth. And that is now the main danger. The goal of this faction is what it has been for the last several years. That is to say, the clash of civilizations, the war of civilizations. The notion that U.S.-British world domination can only be maintained by promoting the battle of all against all along religious lines. And here's the choke point, of course, as you see, the Straits of Hormuz, the oil aorta of the world through which pass 1/3 of the oil of the world, and the entire supply line for the U.S. forces in Iraq also goes through there in the other direction. Now, I've called attention to the danger of the encirclement and indeed the annihilation of the U.S. forces inside Iraq. If you see their supply line, goes from Kuwait City to Baghdad. If we have the Mahdi army, those are the green arrows, or the Iranians coming across in case of a war, these are 2 400-mile roads that are virtually impossible to defend. And all you need is a bunch of people with machine guns and bazookas or whatever they call them, RPGs. And this can be cut. And therefore, the neocon faction's plan to have this attack is the very midsummer of madness. Now, don't take it from me. Here's Zbigniew Brzezinski. He was the head of the National Security Council for President Carter. He's one of the foreign policy gurus of the Democratic Party. And he said in testimony to the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on February 1st, the scenario that we're now living through for a collision with Iran involves a terrorist act in the U.S. blamed on Iran. That's the Cheney doctrine. New 9/11, attack on Iran, martial law in the U.S., and who knows where else. Right now, the Cheney plan is bogged down in the interagency bureaucracy. He's not fighting through the bureaucratic channels. He's got to go around them. He's got to do an end run. He needs an engineered incident, a manufactured provocation outside of him. So this is the heart and soul of the entire Cheney effort. And it's no secret. It's written on the walls. It's written on the front pages of world magazines. Now, on the 26th of August, I was part of a group issuing this warning. And, of course, the key notion here is the immediate impeachment of Cheney as a way to encourage loyal and patriotic officers not to obey illegal orders to attack Iran. And you have to state before the court of world public opinion, and I'll say it right now, if there is an attack with weapons of mass destruction anywhere in the world under cover of terrorism, the prime suspect is not Hezbollah, not Al-Qaeda, not any of these groups. It is Cheney himself, his backers, his supporters, people in his office like Addington, Wormser, and so forth, the Cheneyites, as we can call them. Now, this turned out to be as intelligence. This was not bad intelligence, because 3 days after it was posted, we had the infamous Rogue B-52 incident, and you know what this is, I hope. Going from North Dakota to Louisiana, a B-52 intercontinental strategic bomber with 6 nuclear cruise missiles on board, violating an agreement with the Russian Federation, violating the Air Force's own regulations, and then it got to Louisiana and it came to a halt. On the 5th of September, it was announced that this had been a terrible mistake. 6 airmen, including 2 officers, are dead from the 2 airfields involved. A captain, a lieutenant, Airman Blue, who's a security man, and 2 or 3 others. Dead and no explanation. The U.S. Congress, in its craven Democratic majority, refuses to hold a hearing about this incident. One of the missiles is reported missing. And that may be the missile that Cheney decides to deliver, not to Tehran, but to St. Louis, or Portland, or someplace like this. And that's, of course, where the missile was attached. On October 16th, we had an actual launch of a U.S. Patriot anti-missile missile from Qatar, as you see in the Gulf. One of these Patriots, it's supposed to be ABM, an anti-ballistic missile. They don't work very well, but this was obviously a provocation vis-a-vis Iraq to see what they would do. Now, Putin, I have to tell you, I welcome the return of Russia, and I applaud the action of Putin to restore some kind of balance in world affairs. If there's a single force that is preventing the neocon fascist madmen from doing their dirty work, it is their fear of what this man represents. And he's pointed out there must be no attack on Iran. He has compared Bush to a madman running around with a razor blade. He actually said that for Thanksgiving. Is this guy Freddy, in the Elm Street movies, the guy with the glove? And he has also said the current situation is like the Cuban Missile Crisis. If you put ABM missiles into Poland, that's the equivalent of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And just in that week that we showed you, October 16th, the Russians tested another Topol-M intercontinental ballistic missile, which is the most advanced ICBM anywhere in the world. And again, I hope the neocons know, because that's the issue. Cheney represents a war psychosis. He represents a flight forward into escalation. He'd say, well, we're defeated conventionally in Afghanistan and Iraq. We must escalate to the nuclear level and deal with Iran with nuclear weapons. And this, of course, is then the slide into World War III, because you'll be killing Russians and Chinese in the reactors and in the oil fields if you do it. And now we have our dear little friend reminding us on October 17th, World War III. It is an act of incalculable folly. There was a big taboo about this. American presidents are not supposed to even talk about World War III, but that's all water under the bridge now. And this is what Kenny Bunkport warning was attempting to remind people of. Now you can see he's actually invented something new, right? The old way was like this. He's introduced a new variation. He's very proud of himself for this. But World War III, and if there's one fact that you have to somehow assimilate and internalize, it is that we are on the brink of World War III. And my slogan for the evening, as always, is get active or get radioactive. And it's a very timely slogan. Find ways to become active. This is the alternative. And this, if you thought we left that behind with the Cold War, I'm afraid we didn't. And for those of us of my age, that is a terrible feeling. I lived through one Cuban Missile Crisis, and now I'm living through another one, and I don't like it. I want it to end. Bruegel's triumph of death. This is what the neocons represent. This is what they're bringing us. And right now it is Cheney-Bush combination with very few allies, maybe none, that are pushing forward on this path. So the question is tonight, who can stop World War III? Time magazine tells us, you can. You are Person of the Year. I don't come to regale you. I come to recruit you. When I give this talk in the U.S., I tell people, run for office. We need 469 Americans next November to run for every seat in the House of Representatives and every seat in the Senate that's open, minimum. And we need staffs and backers for all of them. If you can run for office in this country, if they still have elections, get into them. Otherwise, join the Radical Truth Campaign that I've been a guest of. Join the British 9/11 Truth Campaign. They're a wonderful group. We have a similar group in Ireland, and there are other people in Europe as well. So here's my thesis for tonight. If everything Cheney wants to do, the depends on a false flag going over, then if we can educate world public opinion so they don't believe in false flags, if they become sophisticated and not naive on this vital issue, then maybe we can stop World War III that way. Obviously, there are more things. The British government should immediately leave NATO. When Harry Truman said nuclear weapons back during the Korean War, Clement Attlee came over for a summit conference right away. This time, Bush says World War III, nothing. Gordon Brown say anything? Nothing that I've heard of. And this is the time when we really got to get out there and do something, or simply join, as I say, the activist group. Now, this is going to sound like conspiracy theory. Of course, we have all these inhibitions about conspiracy theory. Well, I have none. The short answer to conspiracy theory is, yeah, it used to be a theory, but it's not a theory anymore because it's been proven. But if you look at this list of worthies, right, pick the ones you like best. Edmund Burke, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, or the U.S. Declaration of Independence. All are conspiracy theorists. You can see this in my book. I give all the quotations in 9/11 Synthetic Terror Radio USA. Here we go. Declaration of Independence. Conspiracy buffs gather in Philadelphia. Because what does it say? It says, he has. George III. And it's all, he says, it doesn't matter what the ministers are, it doesn't matter who's doing it, it's the same plan from beginning to end. It's a conspiracy. So here we have the original conspiracy group of paranoids gathered. The most famous speech in American political history, at least, is the House Divided speech, which adumbrates a conspiracy theory, naturally, as every good American must. I always ask myself, is what I'm doing okay with Lincoln? I think it is. I'll try to show you. This is the House Divided speech, and he says, look, we cannot tell it's pre-concert conspiracy, but when you have Stephen Douglas, Franklin Pierce, Roger Taney, and James Buchanan, Senator, President, Chief Justice, and President, and they're all working on the same project, well, I guess then there may be pre-concert or a conspiracy. In the day of Lincoln, the Mexican War had been started based on a kind of a 9/11 equivalent, a battle that he claimed had taken, the president claimed took place in U.S. territory. And Lincoln always said, no, I want to know where it happened. I want to know the spot. Because he didn't believe it. He fought the 9/11 of his time. That's the point. And they ridiculed him as spotty Lincoln. All right, so today we're conspirators and paranoids. There we go. You're in good company with a well-known conspiracy theorist and paranoid, which just happens to be, in my view, the greatest man of the 19th century. The whole Republican Party, by the way, is built on the slogan of a slave power conspiracy, which was done by Seward for the Republican campaign in 1860. So the party of the president in power was founded on the slave power conspiracy theory. Which brings us here to today, to Guy Fawkes. And of course, you recognize these famous pictures with all the memes and the myth. You can see the lantern, the spurs at night, and he's surprised as he's about to go and blow up the old House of Lords. And here are the conspirators. Let me just point out a couple of them. I want you to note Thomas Winter. He's a patsy. Catesby is a double agent. Fawkes is a patsy. Thomas Percy is a double agent. The rest of these are largely patsies. So it's a group that has at least 2 certified double agents in the group.
Can you just describe exactly what patsy is?
It means that they're being used. It'll become obvious as we go along. So here's the patsies of today, the 19 accused. As we toggle back and forth from the patsies of 400 years ago. So the Anglo-American financier faction has terrorism as its birth pattern, and now as part of its death rattle, because that's what we're living through. Here's the idea. Originally, they rented an adjoining building. They tried to tunnel under here. That took way too long. They started in 1604. And eventually they said, well, why not just do the obvious? Let's rent the cellar of the building and load that up with gunpowder. Except it wasn't gunpowder, as we'll see in just a minute. And this, of course, is Guy Fawkes, the most famous patsy of all time. Meaning, the expression guy, like guys and dolls, comes from him. you guys, fall guy, he's the fall guy. Guy Wire. The Guy Wire is what holds up his statue on the cart in the old days here, where they used to parade him around. So his name has become a very common word in the language, practically synonymous with any individual, a guy, right? So from the patsies of then to the patsies of now, and in particular the demonized Atta, Guy Fawkes, of course, thoroughly demonized. And the target of this was King James I. Not to get rid of him, not to liquidate him, but to change his policy, to make sure that he kept Robert Cecil in power, to make sure that he was more hostile to Spain than he normally would have been, and other reasons. And that's similar to Bush. That Bush is not an integral part of the creation of 9/11, but like James I, he's somebody who comes to realize that it can help him. All right. Now I recommend people to ask me for a source. Francis Edwards of the Jesuits. He lives in London. He's elderly. He's in declining health. I hope he's still going strong. And he's written on all of the Elizabethan plots, the Throckmorton and all the rest. He's written on the Jacobean plots, the Buy, the Maine, the coronation plots, and he's coming out with a 700-page definitive study on the gunpowder plot. Has that been published? Anybody who really follows this? Anyway, he has a summary paragraph. He's also got a short article from a couple of years ago. Here's an older one, the gunpowder plot. There was a flare-up of interest around about 100 years ago or so. And this is a guy called Girard, again, also a Jesuit. I don't endorse the Jesuits, but they're, of course, the ones who want to write all this stuff. And it's often very useful. Now, this entire period of English history, what you may think is Elizabeth and James, it's not. It's the Regnum Cecilianum. It is the rule of the two Cecils, William Cecil, Lord Berkeley, the elder, and Robert Cecil, the Earl of Salisbury, the younger. And their method is a police state. It is to use fear and paranoia directed against Catholics as a principle of rule. And I have to say, this is not widely understood by British historians, because it's based on the fact that Catholics at this point were either a very large minority, or indeed the majority of the country were still Catholics in their religious preferences. And again, go to all those northern mansions with priest holes, and you'll begin to get an idea. We'll come back to this theme in a minute. There's Cecil the Elder. He's the one who controls Queen Elizabeth much of the time. Good Queen Bess, I think, a very bad misnomer. There he is riding on his mule. Now, his right-hand man and sidekick is Francis Walsingham, who founds the British Intelligence Services. This person is a Venetian, and we'll realize why it's important that he's a Venetian. He was, during the time of Bloody Mary, he went to Padua in Italy and was recruited by the Venetians because that's, of course, part of the Venetian state. He was then made the president of the English group at the University of Padua, very numerous, William Harvey, all kinds of important people were there. So he becomes a Venetian. And he's one of the people who bring the Venetian method of intelligence operations, which is the most advanced in the world at the time, here to Britain. And one of the commentators on this, cited by Girard, says that Robert Cecil inherited the double spirit of his predecessor, Walsingham, in his leisure domain. Double spirit, of course, means that you use double agents and dupes to get things done. Today we would say false flag. That's double spirit. Now there's Cecil the Younger. This is a flattering picture because he was not a handsome man. He was disabled in the sense that he was, of course, a hunchback. And Shakespeare makes much of this. Now, I don't know if you can see that. That's the rainbow portrait of Queen Elizabeth I. The best seats for this thing are undoubtedly in front. If you can see what she's got on her cape, it's eyes and ears. Eyes and ears. Look carefully. I wish I had this bigger. She's also got on her sleeve a huge snake, a boa constrictor or something of this sort. And again, this is a toga of hers that is emblematic. Again, look at all those eyes, look at all those ears. That she presides over a police state. And you have sadists worthy of Lavrenti burial. You have this guy called Topcliffe. Topcliffe takes prisoners home from the tower and keeps them in his home so he can torture them if he gets bored in the night. He can have some sessions. The The character of Polonius in Hamlet, right? The really sententious, lecturing, hectoring old nincompoop, Laertes, neither a borrower nor a lender be. That's Cecil the Elder. And above all, what Shakespeare wants to point out is the guy's a hypocrite. Because if you look at Polonius, he's trying to sell his daughter to get social advancement for himself. That's Robert Cecil, the younger. Now Shakespeare hates him even more. He is the original for Richard III. Lots of I lay, inductions dangerous, and so forth. In other words, intrigue, deception, playing one person against another, trying to dupe people into destroying themselves, to create deadly hatred. That's Richard III equals Robert Cecil. Caliban in The Tempest, the misshapen creature, Robert Cecil. There he is again in another portrait. He's also Lord Angelo in Measure for Measure, the hypocrite who pretends to be so pure, and then he's trying to abuse young women and take them to bed in a completely hypocritical way. And he's also Iago in Othello, the Venetian who's whispering into Othello's ear and making him jealous and getting him to destroy himself. All of these are images from Shakespeare or Robert Cecil. And his method, as you see here, it's the same one that's being used today. On the way over here, 2,000 terrorists in Britain. Well, when the Catholics, the papists, became too popular, you have to fix some design on them which the common people will believe, and then go to town. Same thing that we've seen on 7/7, 9/11, and all the rest. Now, the goals of the Cecil faction are obviously to keep the power of the Cecil bloc. They also want to have the oppression of Catholics because that is the cause that they have wedded, and that's the only way that they can keep this possible majority down. The other goal is war with Spain, and we'll see why that is in just a minute. So here we are in Lent of 1604. This is all documented. And again, if you'd like to get a copy of the slideshow, you can just give a service fee to the group. One of the people, Catesby, rebel agent, meets Winter, Duke, and says, let's do something to help the Catholics. King James had promised tolerance, but he was not delivering. Then if you wanted to do something, you'd probably go after Robert Cecil himself, who was the most hated and everybody knew was the embodiment of this policy. But instead they say, let's blow up everything. The king, the lords, the commons, everybody else, including many, many Catholics, who are going to get blown up, because there are lots of them in the House of Lords. Here's a report, and you can see it's all here, Public Record Office, Calendar of State Papers, Domestic. This is an agent, an intelligence, or poursuivant, as they were called, to Sir Thomas Challenger, one of Cecil's lieutenants. He says there's a discoverer named Davies who's working a plot with the goal of incriminating priests, and he's trying to get some of the top Jesuits. And the guy says he can incriminate 60 priests. And they say, you don't need that many, just try to get us some top Jesuits. The guy, however, is not going to go forward until he gets his pardon in advance. And he gets it. And that's all in the file. So this is the beginning of the gunpowder plot by an agent provocateur of Cecil. Now, at a certain point, one of the Jesuits who realizes, an underground Jesuit in England at the time, he writes to the Pope. And he says, look, they're planning this crazy thing. What should we do? Well, Aquaviva, the general of the Jesuit order, writes back to him saying, stop. The Pope says, cease and desist because this is going to hurt us. We don't need it. Now, the problem, of course, is that when it all became public, Pope Paul V Borghese, that's the guy who's got his name on the front of the Vatican. If you've ever been there, it says Paulus V Borghesius right in the middle of the facade. He did not come out and denounce it, so that he opened himself up, because he felt, politically, he thought a lot of his people were actually sympathetic. It's one of the common weaknesses that you have. Now, the person who rented that building that we had up before is an agent of the Percy family. And this is a minor Percy. This is not the Percy. The Percys are the Dukes of Northumberland, as you know. But the idea is that the attempt is to steer it into this direction. Now, Percy Thomas is one of those people we saw in the picture. And this is one of the main pieces of proof. Sir Francis Moore is going home late at night in the middle of London, goes by the Middle Temple, and he meets Mr. Percy, one of the conspirators who's going to die, coming out of the great statesman's house, meaning Robert Cecil's house, and wondered what his business should be there. Coming out at 2 o'clock in the morning. Now, the only defense against this one is to say, yeah, it was so dark, he didn't know who it was. Yeah, but wait a minute, he met him. He probably said, hi, how are you doing? Up late tonight, what's going on? Right? So they exchanged words. It doesn't say he saw him. It says he met him. So, Percy is a double agent, a tame duck used to catch wild ones. In other words, these typical groups that we've seen, the 7-7 group and similar groups in the U.S., there are double agents in the middle who know what they're doing, and then they're surrounded by fanatics, dupes, and others. One of the targets is the leading Catholic nobleman in the country, or one of them, Lord Northumberland, also of the Percy family, but not the same guy. This guy will later end up in the Tower of London, and he's going to spend a long time there. Now, the guy who rents the house is Sir Dudley Carleton. And you think, well, if you rent the house from which they try first to dig under the House of Lords, your career is over, right? Wrong. This guy will go on to become the Foreign Secretary. In other words, he'll go all the way to the top of the government, about as far as he could go. He becomes Lord Dorchester, Viscount Dorchester. So notice a pattern. If people take part in these actions and then they get promoted, false flag. There's Dudley Carleton. Ambassador to Venice, a Venetian. Now, Catesby is the other double agent, as I tried to point out, right? Percy, Catesby. Here is a deathbed confession. Catesby's servant, Bartlett, on his deathbed confessed that his master, Catesby, went to Salisbury House to meet Cecil several nights before the discovery and was always brought in privately at a back door. So we got the two double agents absolutely established. Winter is most likely a patsy who simply works for one of these peripheral figures. Mount Eagle, the Mount Eagle letter, I can't go into that. It's too complicated. But this is a patsy who does not know what he's doing. Now, how many times have you seen these images of 9/11? 500,000 times, 1 million times? I don't know. It certainly seems too many. In those days, of course, they don't have that, but they do their very best. And let's count if they all have the correct meanings of the myth. Because remember, the mean is nighttime, the lantern, and the spurs. Okay, there's the original. Nighttime, lantern, and spurs, and he's caught in flagrante delicto. How about this one? Divine illumination exposes him, and he's got the lantern, and I think he's got his spurs to the powder plot. How about this one? Here he does not have spurs, but he's got his lantern. But his own head is already displayed in the corners of the House of Lords. Digitus Dei Hic, right? Here is the finger of God. How about this one? A plot with powder. Black deed. The Lord beholds. So there he is. Faux. Guy faux. Like faux news. This is a Dutchman. Here we have the powder plotters down here. And up here we have the king and the lords already meeting. This never happened this way. Because, of course, it started the night before, last night. Here's another one. Here we have the Pope having one of his usual luncheon meetings with the devil. And another devil is over here blowing in Fawkes' ear as he goes into the basement of the House of Lords. This is Fawkes' lantern, displayed, I believe, at Oxford. I'm sorry, I don't have the whole caption. Now here's a German print of the same print we saw, and again, the agents are Catesby and Percy. And they will die together, standing back to back. They're going to get cut down because they've got to be eliminated, because they know too much. So these are double agents who get killed. And why not? And again, it's the same method. Now here's a very interesting thing. The whole thing is blown the night before, last night. But Catesby and others, Percy, ride to the main Catholic area. And where do you think the main Catholic area is? Stratford-on-Avon, Warwickshire. Now my notions of geography have become a little bit blurry. But the main Catholic prayers, they go there and they say, rebel, rebel, rebel. Come out of your houses, arm yourselves, come in the streets, get sing with us, so then Percy can chop everybody's, Cecil can chop everybody's head off. Get the idea? What Cecil wants to do is to flush out all the opposition, get them out in the open, and crush them. So and he goes to the area of Shakespeare. Now, irony. The gunpowder involved in the gunpowder was not gunpowder. It was corn powder, meaning a very inferior, very large grain type of powder. And in this case, we find it was decayed corn powder. So decayed or inert corn powder. And where did they get it? They got it from the Royal Arsenal, from the War Office. Here you see, November 1605. Now this is from the Daily Telegraph back in 1978, and it means that those big barrels of gunpowder that were there for show were not going to be able to explode. So the whole thing is a fraud. But this shows that there was comprehensive technical assistance from the Royal Arsenal and from the War Office. This contrasts unfavorably with the FBI at the World Trade Center in 1993, when the FBI said, one of the patsies, one of the informants involved said, why don't we just use an inert powder? We can get them anyway. And the FBI says, no, we got to have the real thing. We got to have something that will really explode. So let's call it from now on the decayed corn powder plot of 1605. A provocation by Cecil using Catholic double agents and patsies. A couple of other people involved, Ben Jonson, the bad poet in my view. He's in contact with Catesby, Tresham, and Winter, and at a certain point, Robert Cecil goes to Ben Jonson and says, I want you to find me certain Catholic priests because I want to ask them a few questions. And there he is. Where does he go? He goes to the Venetian ambassador's home. Now the reason this is important is this shows you that the Venetian embassy is up to its neck in the middle of the intrigue. And this is a very important fact. One of my main points tonight is if you don't understand the Venetians as being a key part of it, you can't understand the whole thing. The superpower of intelligence in the world at this point is Venice, and they've been doing it for centuries. Now we have the question of torture, also interesting compared to our own time. These are 3 signatures by Fawkes. Before torture, after some torture, and after more torture. Looks like he's been tortured pretty well. Beginning, end. We also have the confession of Thomas Wintour. Now again, it's Winter, but he writes it Wintour. We have possible torture, possible forgery. Let's take a look. Here's a letter by Winter before he's arrested. There's his signature, right? Wintour. That's how he really writes. Here's his confession. Thomas Winter. Now, there are 2 things. It's spelled differently. In those days, you could spell things any way you wanted, but usually you'd stick to one spelling for your own name, right? Usually. And there's his real signature, and here's the confession. So did he sign the confession? I would say no. Again, here's his original signature, real, and here's the confession. You think that's the same? Or isn't that some expert graphologist working for Cecil who can make a confession in any language you want? Here's another confession. And this one this is this guy, Coke. I guess it's written Cook, but I understand you have to say Coke, the Lord, the Attorney General. And he says, the witnesses to this are Nottingham, Suffolk, and all these other people, Salisbury, except they haven't signed it. Those are not individual signatures. That's all written by Cook. See? So it means that the confessions on which this entire plot is supposedly based are basically false. This is an interesting sidelight. One of the people who was supposedly arrested, a pro-Jesuit by the name of Tresham, was later seen by none other than Dudley Carleton in Brussels when he was supposed to be in jail. Now this reminds us of the Barbara Olson case vis-a-vis 9/11, like this phantom was repeatedly seen in different parts of the world. Very important, I would say, is that the gunpowder plot leads to civil war. It is one of the bases, I think, of the English Civil War, in the sense that out of this comes a Puritan opposition, an extreme anti-Catholic, anti-Spanish party that want more and more emphasis on gunpowder, like the neocons, who demand that the entire public life of the U.S. and other countries should be involved with 9/11. And of course, the Stuarts are not willing to go that far. James I never wants to really have a war with Spain. Charles I doesn't really want to have a war with Spain. And therefore, ultimately, they are overthrown. I think this is a key part of it. In other words, if you try to build your state on terrorism and the war on terrorism, you will fail. It is doomed. And that's, of course, what Bush has done. When he talks about Iraq, it's not about Iraq, it's about 9/11. And it's always about 9/11. It's 9/11, 24/7, 365 days a year. A very interesting book by a German scholar from Mainz, The True Face of William Shakespeare. Her name is Hildegard Hammerschmidt-Hummel. And what she proves, of course, is that the most distinguished representative of the large Catholic minority, or again, the majority, is Shakespeare. He's a dedicated Catholic activist. Now, notice how they translate the book into English. This is German originally of Hammerschmidt-Hummel. The Hidden Existence of William Shakespeare. And down here we read, Dichter und Rebell im katholischen Untergrund. Poet and rebel in the Catholic underground. So he's fighting Cecil from inside the court, and he's also in touch with Jesuits and other people in the European scene. The idea here is that the lost years were spent in Italy, that he got his little Latin and less Greek at a Jesuit school in Belgium, because his mother was, Mary Arden, was a Catholic. All the Ardens are Catholic. The Shakespeare's also Catholic. His daughter was once accused of being a Catholic. He's a Catholic. He's part of the opposition. This is one of the reasons for all these theories that try to say he didn't exist. Because not only is he a commoner, but he's a Catholic. And that, the Whig conception of history can't stand it. And she has proof. She has, this is the signing book at the Collegium Inglese in Rome of the Jesuits. And here we have Arturus Stratfordus, Arthur of Stratford. And she says that's a cover name for Shakespeare. I believe it is. Here's another one. This is Stratfordus Castrensis, another year, another visit by Shakespeare. And there's another one where it appears as Gulielmus Stratfordus, William of Stratford. Probably Shakespeare. And these are exactly, as you see the years, right here, 18, 15, 87. Those are your lost years. So she fills up the lost years with that. Before the gunpowder plot, I'm switching now, my source now becomes Claire Asquith, a very good recent book called Shadow Play. Claire Asquith has written the best interpretation of all the Shakespeare plays that I've ever found from this idea that he's a Catholic and he's speaking in code because he's oppressed. Othello is essentially a warning to James I. Don't let that Venetian devil, Robert Cecil, wreck you and your government. Again, Lord Angelo, you've got that one. King Lear. King Lear is essentially having to do with this oath of supremacy. What does King Lear want? He says, you've got to declare that you love me more than anybody else. And what James I does is he says, you've got to sign a paper that says, I'm supreme over the Pope, not the Pope over me. And as Shakespeare warns, you're going to alienate your real supporters, right? Cordelia, Gloucester, Cantilever, and so forth. And you're going to be betrayed by the people who pretend to be loyal to you, Goneril, Regan, Edmund. Okay? Very interesting interpretation. The play immediately after Gunpowder is, of course, Macbeth, full of murder, burning, tragedy, and all the rest. I believe it is not an endorsement of the official version, but it is basically saying to his fellow Catholics, don't you be patsies anymore. And I think probably the Muslim community in Britain and around the world could also learn something from this. Tell your people, don't be patsies. Don't let yourself be led into these things by various kinds of double agents. The other play, very heavily influenced by Gunpowder, is of course Coriolanus, comes right after it. And again here, fire, the burning of Rome, you're preparing a fire. This is the imagery that Shakespeare is using to comment on the Gunpowder plot. The ultimate irony is that James was not going to show up anymore. It's a prorogued parliament. It's simply the continuation of a parliamentary session that had already begun, and this therefore means that the king is not going to come. So the whole idea that they were going to blow up the king is a fraud, because he wasn't going to come. So the whole thing, I think we've cut through it. Now, that concludes the gunpowder plot. I don't know, have I convinced people? I hope I have. I hope you'll see that this is a fraud, and that Guy Fawkes is indeed the patsy. Now, who did this? Who does this stuff? What I would like to argue is that the perpetrator of the gunpowder plot on one level is Robert Cecil, but then in another higher level, it's the faction behind him. And I would call that the Venetian part of Britain, of England in this case. I'm not alone. I have very important backup coming from Benjamin Disraeli in just a minute, but this would be my view. Now, I think this is an interesting statement. I don't know if this is clear, but it's a Venetian canal in the foreground and the dome of St. Paul's in the background. So London and Venice merge. It's very important because the Whig party of England is essentially a continuation of the Venetian oligarchy. This is now the theme I'd like to turn to. The perpetrators are the Venetian party of England, the pro-Venetian faction of the English political scene. I've written about this for many years, 30 years now, going back to the first essays in Against Oligarchy. Venice. Now, the English have the best fleet. The Dutch have a real good fleet too. Sometimes theirs is better. The Spanish have the best infantry. The French have the best heavy cavalry. But who has the best intelligence service? Venice. Diplomatic service, Council of Ten. It's a whole oligarchical state built on secret intelligence methods. They are the world champions. And they believe in using religion as a tool of state policy. You know Venice, right? The lagoons in the Adriatic, here it is. And it goes all the way out into the eastern Mediterranean, as you see there. Now, they had operations going in England. If anybody knows Professor John Bossy, he's a very respectable academic historian, and he shows that Giordano Bruno, the so-called philosopher Giordano Bruno, was active in London as a Venetian agent, and I'm adding the Venetian part, he doesn't get to that, but that he's essentially working undercover in the French embassy here in London, down by the Thames, in the late 1580s, and that Giordano Bruno is the guy who blows up something called the Throckmorton Plot. And I can't get into the details of this, but the Throckmorton Plot is the pretext used by William Cecil and Queen Elizabeth I to chop off the head of Mary Queen of Scots. So that heats up the European situation, because the Spanish Armada of 1588 is King Philip's answer to the fact that the Queen has been executed. So this gets to be really big stuff. So Giordano Bruno in London, with the Throckmorton Plot, Mary Queen of Scots decapitated, and the King of Spain goes wild and sends the Armada. It's pretty heavy stuff. I hope you agree. So the Venetians are capable of this. This is what Bossy has discovered. That Giordano Bruno, who was later executed himself in Rome, I'm going to be speaking there next week, right in the same square where they burn him. I hope they don't burn me. Campo dei Fiori. I hope to escape. Is a Venetian agent. That's what I relate to, and I've written extensively about that. And of course, the person running all this is Walsingham. We've already seen that he's a Venetian. Let's see some other Englishmen that are actually Venetians underneath. Sir Henry Wotton, maybe not famous, he was the provost of Eton, right? If the Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing field of Eton, this is the guy who got Eton going in a grand way. He's also the guy who brings in the architecture of Palladium. So you couldn't have any of those English country houses without him. He gets it from the Venetians. John Donne, Venetian, loves the Venetians. No man is an island, right? The famous sermon is an appeal to England to intervene in the 30 Years' War to help the Venetians. So Dudley Carleton, we've seen, he becomes the Foreign Secretary. And the person behind this is someone that you may not know, but you should know, because he is the greatest intelligence game master of the early 17th century. It is Paolo Sarpi. Paolo Sarpi. He is the main theological and juridical consultant of the Venetian oligarchy. He is an intelligence game master without Peter. He is one of the people who helped start the 30 Years' War, 1618 to 1648, which killed about 1/3 of the people in Central Europe. Now, This is in the Bodleian Library in Oxford, and you'll see he's Paulus Sarpius Venetus Concilii Tridentini e Viscerator. He's the guy who tore the guts out of the Council of Trent. Trevor Roper loves him. All the British historians love him. He's the greatest of the Protestant historians. Hume loves him. Just endlessly. Gibbon loves him. They all love him. He's the most famous person in Europe who's not a head of state. And he's a hero of the Protestant world. Shakespeare, on the other hand, anti-Venetian. And I think there's a whole area of research here to reinterpret Shakespeare from the point that what he's fighting is indeed the Cecils and their policy, but it's principally the Venetians. Ben Jonson, the big enemy of Shakespeare, certainly not his friend, is Ben Jonson, as far as I can see. If you look at Ben Jonson, the tribe of Ben, meeting I think at the Mermaid Tavern here, what's the ideology? They love Venice, right? Think of Volpone, right? Johnson's Volpone. I've read Contarini, I've read all the Venetian authors, says the guy in Volpone. Sir Francis Bacon is Cecil's cousin, and he is an avid correspondent of Sarpi. Except that Sir Francis Bacon doesn't want to do all the work himself. He gets a secretary to help him, and that's the young Thomas Hobbes. So Bacon and Hobbes are both heavily imbued with the Venetian outlook because of their traffic with Paolo Sarpi. Later on, Shaftesbury, Ashley Cooper, patron of Locke, is going to end up in the Venetian register. Now, the problem that the Venetians had at the beginning of the 1600s was everybody was making peace. There's a peace between England and Spain, a peace between France and Spain, there's a peace between Austria and Turkey, and the Venetians don't like that because the Venetians want everybody to be tied up and balanced with wars far away from Venice. Because if people are at peace, they may decide that Venice is very rich and very weak and a choice morsel ready to be plucked. So the thesis is there is an English-Venetian party. My biggest supporter, now I got to all of this myself many years before, but here we have none other than the young Benjamin Disraeli, Lord Beaconsfield, who comes forward in his novel, Coningsby. I recommend you really read Coningsby, 1844. And what he says essentially is that the Whig nobility, the top level aristocrats, are the Venetian party. That the King of Britain is a doge, meaning the Duke of Venice, a weak elected monarch, and that the King Lords and the Commons are the Venetian constitution. A quote, the great object of the Whig leaders in England, from the first movement under Hampden to the more successful one in 1688, the so-called Glorious Revolution, was to establish in England a high aristocratic republic on the model of the Venetian. Absolutely correct. The reign of Queen Anne, and this is the part that's written about by Jonathan Swift. I strongly recommend you look at Jonathan Swift because he was on the good side. He was on the anti-Venetian side. All the good guys are anti-Venetian. The reign of Anne was a struggle between the Venetian and the English systems. George I then was a doge. George II was a doge. George III wanted not to be a doge, but he couldn't stand it. It had been institutionalized. And then the other guy says, I'm sure these ideas are not very well known. And Coningsby says, you have had your history written for you by the Venetian party, and it has been in their interest to conceal it. Read Coningsby. You don't even have to read the whole thing. The operative passages are about 10 or 15 pages where they're talking about this stuff. And I strongly, strongly recommend it. This was part of the Young England movement. It was anti-Whig, pro-Tory, therefore limited. So, the only other thing to add to gunpowder is that gunpowder, of course, targets the Pope and Spain. But what do you do when the Spanish collapse in the 30 Years' War and France becomes the biggest power in Europe, which they do about 1660, 1670, 1680? Well, you have another plot. This one manufactured out of absolutely nothing. This is now Titus Oates, who's simply a mythomaniac. A mythomaniac is a guy who gets a lot of ego gratification out of telling a fantastic story and getting lots and lots of attention. And that's Titus Oates. And he invents the Popish plot. of 1678. He comes forward and says, the King of France and the Pope are going to come and take over the country. And people believe it. And some reports say the hysteria is even greater. And they say that to doubt the plot was worse than being a member of the plot, they said. Now, of course, this is carried out by Lord Ashley Cooper, Shaftesbury, with the help of John Locke, the so-called philosopher that I'm going to attack in just a minute. But notice now, they've made the adjustment. They redirected the hysteria to say, not the King of Spain and the Pope, but now the King of France and the Pope. And what do you get out of this? You get about 2 centuries of warfare. How many dead? What kind of a diminution of the living standard and all that? How much human suffering comes out of this manipulation? Now I really have to ask for your patience because I have to do an obligatory attack on British empiricism. And I realize that I'm not going to destroy British empiricism in 10 or 15 minutes, but I have to try. I've been trying to destroy American pragmatism for these many years, and I haven't quite succeeded there, but I have to try. One of the biggest problems in understanding these operations is empiricism, or pragmatism, the notion that the sense data are everything. And I'm trying to say, no, they're not. Locke, of course, is a servant of the Venetian party. These are the people who helped to bring you the Titus Oaths. In other words, Locke and Shaftesbury, above all, are the people who bring you this popish plot. And about 30 to 40 people are executed. In other words, more people get killed in this than get killed in the gunpowder, I think. And Locke, of course, is working for this Whig cabal, right? Clifford, Arlington, Buckingham, Ashley Cooper, Lauderdale, right? The names are written across the map of the U.S. even today, right? From Arlington, Virginia to Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And again, the method is Tarpley. Now, I have written an essay, I presented an essay a couple of years ago in Tunisia at the Colloque de Carthage, the philosophical colloquium of Carthage, which was dedicated to Locke, Descartes, and Leibniz. And I wrote about the fact that the essay on human understanding by John Locke, his main work, is actually copied from Paulo Sartre. He is a plagiarist. He simply takes the main ideas and then expands. So that Locke is not an original philosopher, but a thinly veiled plagiarist of a book called, a small book called The Art of Thinking Well, Arte di Ben Pensare, of Paulo Sartre of Venice. Now this is, I think, an important fact because it shows that the founder of English empiricism, Locke, is really working off a Venetian original. And you'll see this pattern again and again. People that you think are famous English writers are actually plagiarists of a Venetian original. Now what I want to argue is that concepts are what matters. Notice that the kind introduction I had said, we're here for vital concepts, not for a load of information, because that you can't remember, but concepts that count. And the concepts are something separate from the information, and they're important. In other words, I didn't want to say no to William of Ockham back in the 14th century. William of Ockham, already in those days, the Venetians had people in England. The way you can tell this is at the beginning of the 100 Years' War. So we're in the 1340s. This is a guy who says, yes, the King of England can tax churches to finance the 100 Years' War. Why? Because the Venetians wanted England to attack France, so France would not be able to attack Venice. And at the time, the Venetians were locked in the final struggle with the Genoese. So this is a guy who is serving Venetian interest. I would call him a Venetian operative at that time. Now, Occam's razor. What is Occam's razor? Well, entia non sunt multiplicanda praeter necessitata. You should not multiply the number of entities beyond necessary. What he means by this is concepts are no good. Concepts are not real. Concepts do not exist. Because he would say, well, the concept is another entity that we don't need. And I'm here to tell you, yeah, you do need it. And you do need the concept, and you do need the pattern. And that is above the individual cases. So, the Venetian impact on European philosophy is simply immense and all bad. Now, what I would recommend is Plato, And here's Plato's cave, and you know the story, right? The people are chained there. They have to spend their time looking at the shadows on the rock face in front of them. There's a fire, there's some flickering sunlight, there's some people who come and show effigies and project shadows on the wall. What is this predicament? It is, of course, our own. We spend all our time looking at flickering shadows on television screens, movie theater screens, computer screens. We're the prisoners, in many ways, of flickering shadows. And if we think of the modern age, the shadow that flickers most frequently is the 9/11 nightmare. And this is an attempt to imprison the spirit of humanity inside a monstrous myth and fabrication. It is meant to suffer, because it basically says we're going to kill the human mind with this kind of a method. And I urge you to fight back. Now, the way you fight back, this is Plato again. It's all from the 7th book of the Republic. That images, these are the sense data, right? This is simply the facts, the sense data, opinions, you might call them. Above the level of simple empiricism and facts and reflections, there's a level of understanding, right? Verstand, which is superior. It's mathematical thinking, and it's better. But beyond that is reason, hopefully dialectical reason, Vernunft. This is better. And the empiricist remains down here. The Cartesian or the Kantian can get up here. But we want to be together with Plato, Leibniz, and the other really great ones. We want to join the camp of reason, because reason allows us to provide a conceptual overview of all this stuff. Now, conceptual overview, what? Question was here before, the lady here in front. What am I talking about? Patsies, moles, and technicians. This is the idea. This is the conceptual framework that I propose to study terrorism in general, and we can see it's already implicit in the gunpowder plot. And that would be the patsies, the dupes, useful idiots, fanatics, police agents, double agents, provocateurs, Oswald, Guy Fawkes, people like this. They're the patsies. The moles are the people in the government who are actually working for a private network or private cause. The Cecils, or the people in the U.S. government that I'll show you as at least suspected moles, or people who have been mentioned as moles. I know I have to watch out in this country. And then we have the technicians, like the professional killers. And these would be your CIA, Special Forces, old boys, your military security experts, private military firms, and the rest. I would stress the existence of a privatized command center, not in the government, but most likely privatized. Government resources are accessed by way of drills and exercises. We'll show you that too. And it all operates in the brainwashed world of the controlled corporate media, or in your case, the brainwashed world of the BBC and its competition. And I would urge you to look at this, because this allows you to take empirical data, information as it's called, which is meaningless, and make it into something that's going to make sense by putting it into a conceptual overview. And again, this is available in my book. Now, the patsies are, of course, the fall guys. And our dear friend Guy Fawkes is the original one. There's Guy Fawkes, Lee Harvey Oswald, typical patsy, low-grade subject. He's an agent of the FBI, an agent of the CIA, and an agent of the U.S. Customs, all combined. But he doesn't know what he's doing. He doesn't think he's going to get killed. Therefore, he said, and you've heard him say it, I'm just a patsy. Exactly right. This, the film of Oswald saying it. The other problem with the patsy is, can they really do what they're accused of having done? In other words, do they have the physical, technical capability to carry out the crimes attributed to them? Now, with this Landischer carbine from the First World War with a kind of a toy gun sight on it, he's supposed to have gotten off the 3 shots to kill Kennedy, and of course there were 7 or 8 shots. And he's supposed to do that in the available time of an old-fashioned bolt action. It's absurd. He could be the devil incarnate. He can't kill somebody in that situation with that kind of weapon. And the other thing about patsies is they are expendable. You can be a double agent, and he was, up to a point. He didn't shoot anybody. As he said, he never killed anybody. But he had to be liquidated because he knew much too much. Again, similar to the ones we've seen. Zacharias Musawi, the so-called 20th hijacker, his own lawyer said that he was a delusional schizophrenic. And I believe he was. He was processed here through London, through Finsbury, Brixton, and these areas. How about Richard Reed, the shoe bomber? That's why in the U.S. you still can't wear your shoes onto the aircraft. A mentally disturbed, homeless man found sleeping in one of those two mosques, like the schools for patsies here in London, and then sent on a suicide mission. But of course the idea was that he was such a basket case that the poor guy could never succeed, and he's now serving life in prison in one of these American fortresses. And again, is this the face of a force that's going to conquer the world, or is it the face of a hapless victim, which I would suggest? Zarqawi, let's have some fun. How about Al-Qaeda in Iraq? They were a lot of fun. Zarqawi, right? He's now allegedly dead. Who knows whether he ever lived. Here's a Zarqawi. Look, here's one Zarqawi, here's another one. Is it the same guy? Here's a bunch of Zarqawis. Now tell me how many Zarqawis you see. Because every important patsy is not really one patsy. For Bin Laden, you see, Bin Laden is a theater company. There's a whole theater company of people making money as Bin Ladens. We have a fat Bin Laden for the winter, a thin Bin Laden for the summer. We have a Bin Laden for every season. We have an angry one. We have a jolly one for the holidays. We have everything. How many Zarqawis? How many do you see? Anybody? I see 3, but maybe you're right. We actually found out who they were. Hollywood Arab terrorist, Sydney used car dealer, Italian pedophile priest, and New York Jewish dentist. Those are the 4. How about Zawahiri? Now everybody knows Bin Laden is a basket case. He's a dreamer, he's an eccentric, he doesn't know theology. Zawahiri seems to be an MI6 agent who knows plenty, and many would say that he is the brains of the operation. Typical, right? The dumb guy works for the U.S. and the smart one works for MI6. It never fails. And of course, Zawahiri goes back to the desire, I think, of the Foreign Office and others, many Israelis, sure, to get rid of Saddam, right? Because they didn't like this Camp David. And this operation here, the killing of Saddam, Zawahiri is part of the backup for that. He's an important part of it. But as I understand it, he was able to come to London and go back to Egypt, and, well, not to Egypt, but other places. So he seems to have a lot of protection. So I think he's an important patsy. And again, all of these people are mobilizable now today for Cheney's operations. Cheney went to Pakistan at the end of February. Cheney said to Musharraf, "You're going to attack Iran using your nuclear weapons." And Musharraf said, "No, I'm not." And the destabilization of Pakistan happened right after Cheney left. And what happened then? Old Zawad here declares war on Pakistan. It's unbelievable. Al-Qaeda attacks the enemies of the U.S., Russia through Chechnya, Serbia through Kosovo, Libya, and in this case now, Pakistan. Bin Laden. They say Bin Laden wasn't getting enough dates. Right? The girls were, these ads they have in the U.S., right? They show the guy with the white hair and the women turn. He's in a bar. He's trying to pick up women. He doesn't get anywhere. And then he gets some hair dye, and then he succeeds immediately. So Bin Laden, his social life was suffering because he was going gray. So now we have the latest Bin Laden, right before 9/11. Bin Laden is now sleek, and my counterintelligence work has allowed me to identify the new actor who's being used to personify Bin Laden. There it is. Revealed here for the first time. And of course, our dear friend. Now here's an interesting one. Sergeant Ali Mohammed was part also of the killing of Sadat, along with Zawahiri. He's a double agent, sorry about this, double agent for the U.S., and he's Bin Laden's body servant, his valet. And what does he do? When Bin Laden wants to go from Sudan to Afghanistan, he organizes the move. When Bin Laden says, "I need some targets in East Africa," Sergeant Ali Mohammed Yetim. Who is he? He's a former major of the Egyptian army who has become a sergeant of the U.S. Special Forces of Fort Bragg, North Carolina. So the U.S. Special Forces provide a body servant for bin Laden. They also provide his travel agency, that's the State Department, his fan club, that's the CIA bin Laden section. His law services come from Mrs. Albright, who protected him from being extradited from Sudan, and some other services too. Bin Laden could not exist without this kind of backup. In other words, patsies are high-maintenance, needy people. It takes a lot to keep them going. Now, a variation of the patsies. Suppose you have a bunch of patsies going. You can create a counter-gang or pseudo-gang. The main theoretician, and I really recommend him, Major Frank Kitson of the British Army, gangs and counter-gangs, he also calls them pseudo-gangs at different points. His other main work, low-intensity operations, subversion, insurgency, and peacekeeping. These are classics. They're read in the U.S. Army all the time. There he is, Kitson. Now here's his problem. He's in Kenya in the early 1950s. The Mau Mau are a nationalist organization that's going to put an end to the colonial regime. What can he do? He says, well, I'll get some disgruntled former Mau Mau, and I'll create my own Mau Mau. And soon, terrible atrocities take place, caused by the other Mau Mau, by the pseudo Mau Mau. So in other words, if I have an important enemy, if I have an Arab nationalist, let's say, what I do is create my own pseudo-gang of Arab nationalists. I have them commit huge atrocities. And this scares the bourgeoisie, it scares the middle class, it scares everybody to the point where they're against it. I hope that's clear. Now, this is what he did in Kenya. The Mau Mau that you've heard of, the killer gangs, are actually the creation of, they're reported to be the creation of this operation that we just said. Most clearly, the so-called Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Without Al-Qaeda in Iraq, Bush would be in really bad shape. Because he's got to be able to argue that the war in Iraq is actually going against Al-Qaeda. And for that, he's got to have Al-Qaeda in Iraq. It means that Al-Qaeda in Iraq is a Kitsonian counter-gang created by US-UK military intelligence. In other words, that man of many faces. He was operating in the Ansar al-Islam enclave in Iraq before the war. U.S. could have bombed them, never bombed them. They needed it, they wanted it. Let's do some moles. Now, Robert Cecil, I guess, is he a mole? Yeah, he's a mole in the sense that he's working in the government and he is loyal to a private agenda, his own. Richard Clarke, the anti-terror czar of the U.S., the one who should have been preventing 9/11. Instead, what he did was create the myth of 9/11. He came into the room in the beginning of the day, 9 o'clock a.m. in the White House, and started saying, bin Laden, bin Laden, bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda. Based on what? Based on absolutely nothing. He said there are multiple attacks. They like multiple attacks. It must be bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda. He repeated this to his contacts at CBS News, CNN, and that is what then went around the world. This is the person who originated the 9/11 myth at 9 o'clock in the morning based on no evidence. Has he ever heard of other terrorist groups? Right? The Irish Republican Army, what do we know? Has he ever heard of deception? Has he ever heard of having an investigation? And there he is. He became the hero of the 9/11 bereaved families because of his histrionic ability. He had a meeting later in the day where he said, okay, we're going to have an interagency task force to find out who did it. We all know bin Laden did it, but now we have to go through the motions. Bush asked him, what do you think it is? Bin Laden, Mr. President. They like multiple attacks. That's the entire basis of the myth. There is no other basis for this myth. It has never been proven. They've never pinned any of those guys with any of the things that are supposedly that have gone on. Mayor Giuliani, sometimes known because of his authoritarianism, Giulianolini or Giuliani. Very important figure. He destroyed the crime scene. There was all this evidence lying around, and he said, we've got to get the stock market working again. Start scoop and dump operations. Of course, scoop meant you're going to scoop up many, many bodies, 400 firemen, police policemen, emergency workers, all those office workers who died. And let's load the steel onto trucks and send it to Staten Island and destroy it. Destroy the evidence as fast as you can. Now, that's illegal. He's a lawyer. He knows that's a crime scene. You can't do that. That's a felony. Especially if it's a commercial airline crash in the U.S. It's a federal felony because you violated the National Transportation Safety Board. So here's Mr. 9/11. He also says he was given advance notice that the towers would collapse. How could anybody know the towers would collapse? The people in the South Tower, the one that came down first, were told, stay where you are. No sweat. No problem. Just have a cup of coffee and go back to work. He was told they were going to come down. How come he was told? And the poor guys and women in the office, poor guys were in the office and they were not told. The head of the Air Force. Well, if you don't have any air defense between Boston and Washington, D.C. for almost 2 hours, 2 hours, Cold War standard would have been 10 or 15 minutes, because then the H-bombs would come down. Here's somebody who couldn't mount not a single fighter arrived in any useful position until about 2 hours were gone, from about 8:15 in the morning until about 10 minutes after 10. And the immediate person involved in this is the head of the Northeast Air Defense Command, Griffiths Air Force Base, Rome, New York, Colonel Marr. His name is his program, right? Noman S. Noman. He's there to mar any effect. He said, I couldn't launch my planes all at once. He only had about 6 or 8 planes. He didn't have a lot of planes because they didn't send away, we'll see. Hey, how come you couldn't launch your planes? He said, well, if I launched all my planes at the same time, they'd all run out of fuel at the same time. This is not the spirit that won the Battle of Midway. And he also said, when he did launch his planes, did he send them to Washington? Anybody honest would have said, I got to protect Washington, because that's the issue of strategic decapitation, right? Because we got to protect Washington. Don't go chasing targets. Just stay over Washington and let them come to you. Instead, he sent his planes to defend an isolated quadrant of the Atlantic Ocean, about 100 miles offshore. So he didn't protect anything. He sent his planes out over the ocean. I think this conduct is not good. I think he's a suspect. Here's Dave Frasca. This is the Islamic Fundamentalism Bureau of the FBI. And he's sitting there, he's getting reports from Minneapolis and from Phoenix, Arizona, saying, there are these Arabs taking flight courses. What do we do? Well, what he did was take the reports and sit on them for several months. And he could have rolled up the patsies. Now, rolling up the patsies makes the operation impossible. Not because the patsies are going to do it, because they can't do it. But because if you don't have the patsies running around, how can you blame them? If all those 19 people were in penitentiaries, you couldn't then accuse them, although they actually did, in one case, try to do that. But you've got to have the patsies out at large, otherwise they can't escape you. Technicians, the third category. Remember, we've done patsies, we've done moles, and now we come to the technicians. Well, the War Office, the guys who gave Guy Fawkes and company the decayed corn powder. More recently, the CIA old boy network revolved around a guy called Theodore Shachter, sometimes known as the Gray Ghost. And they were deeply involved in Iran-Contra gun running and drug running. And he was once listed as a speechwriter for President Bush the Elder. Andrew Marshall, known as Yoda. I hope you know him. Rumsfeld's futurologist. His job was to imagine future attacks and make sure that there was defense. Well, in that case, he didn't do too well, did he? Very sinister figure. He's the head of the Pentagon's Office of Net Assessment. Somebody should come after him with the net. He's been around since the strange loves of the 1950s. He was part of the Herman Kahn and related people in terms of thermonuclear war planning. And of course, if you're willing to contemplate 100 million dead in the first hour, 9/11 hardly exists. It's a pinprick. Then we always have to think about private military firms. Booz Allen Hamilton claims that they have tremendous centers. They can coordinate any operation, even at the largest level. I'm sure they have rooms filled with hundreds of computer consoles that could be used to coordinate a huge effort. A lot of 9/11 researchers say Cheney ran it. How can Cheney run it? Again, with 5 heart attacks, 4 pacemakers, quadruple bypass, alcoholic habit, and his wife yapping in his ear, because Mrs. Cheney, of course, is a well-known ideologue. How about DynCorp? If it's not Bruce Allen, maybe it's DynCorp, or maybe it's the infamous Blackwater. Because these companies all say, we can do anything up to and including thermonuclear war, they say. Well, if you want to see a good movie about moles, patsies, and technicians, this is the one, The Package. It's about a group of U.S. and Soviet officers who want to assassinate Gorbachev in the late 80s to stop arms control. And you see the 3 levels. It's one of the very rare documents. I urge you to take a look at this if you can. Now, we mentioned the Londonistan question. Well, there was a Londonistan back in the 1840s. We have Leopold of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. He happens to be the King of Belgium, installed by the British. And he writes to his niece, Queen Victoria, and he complains. He says, look, in London you have a sort of menagerie, a zoo, of people like Kossuth, the Hungarian, Mazzini, Italian, Lagrange and Le Rouen, French, to let loose occasionally on the continent to render its quiet and prosperity impossible. Now that's Londonistan 150 or 160 years avant la lettre. And it simply means that if you have an empire and if you want to have operations, you've got to have patsy organizations headquartered in your country that you can deploy. And it didn't start with Al-Qaeda. Let's just look at some of this stuff. One of the people involved in this is Jeremy Bentham. He's one of the founders of this entire method. By the way, he copied from Paolo Sarpi. He copied from a different Venetian original. Here we go. He copied from Gian Maria Ortis, a Venetian economist of the 1790s. So whatever you think you know about the hedonistic calculus of Bentham, original source, Gian Maria Ortis. Gian Maria Ortis is so obscure, there's no picture of him on the internet, and I don't even know if one exists. But that's the Venetian original. How about Malthus? Malthus also copied from Gian Maria Ortis. Ortis argued in 1790 that the carrying capacity of the world was 3 billion people. And basically all the other ideas of Malthus come from Ortis. So essentially the principal ideologue of the British Empire gets it all from a Venetian original, the principles of population. Now in this time, the main person, the main operative is Lord Palmerston, but he also operates with the help of other subcontractors, let us say. He's, of course, the inventor of Zionism. It's his idea to destabilize the Ottoman Empire by creating Israel. And the story is that he went to Lord Rothschild and he said, here, we want to send you to Palestine. And Lord Rothschild says, I want to see it in the House of Lords, not under some palm tree in Jerusalem. But Lord Palmerston carried the day. Let's look at Mazzini. Mazzini is a kind of bin Laden of long ago. He was demonized, right? Mazzini was a guy who was supposed to be drinking out of skulls, and he kept a stiletto on his desk so he could stick you and kill you if you said the wrong thing. And he was, of course, blowing people up. They tried to blow up Napoleon III of France. I don't know if this name, but in Italy he's considered one of the founders of the country, but he was a British agent. He was a British agent and a terrorist working for the Admiralty. Here, Stansfeld. This guy was an official of the Admiralty, and you can practically find the checks, the cancelled checks, that Stansfeld used to pay Mazzini. Stansfeld he supposedly was devoted to the unification of Italy. Disraeli, our friend from before, said, you are associated with the worst killers in Europe. Of course he did, and he ran them. Take another example, Urquhart. This guy's not well known either. Anybody ever heard of David Urquhart, Scottish, British ambassador to the Ottoman Empire? He brought the Turkish bath to England. He wanted to bring the harem, but they wouldn't let him. So he brought all this in. And he was the head of a newspaper, I think, called the Weekly People, or the People. And one of the main people working for this was Marx. So Marx is a sub-agent of the British Foreign Office. And I think that is substantially accurate. And I hope I can get the Marxists to, I want to get the Marxists riled up so they want to intervene in the discussion. What does Marx tell you? In 1850, 1860, 1870, the main issue in the world is really the British Empire, which is about to seize total control over the world, right? Attacking Mexico, attacking Russia, attacking China, attacking India even more than they had, and then attacking the U.S., the Civil War. But Marx, you look at Marx, there's nothing about that. What he tells you is, you better fight the bourgeoisie of your own country. The industrialists of your country, France, Germany, those are your enemies. And that's it. It's a recipe for destabilization of those countries. And I think the word on Marx is that he may not have known what he's doing, right? The question is he a dupe or an agent? Only a psychiatrist knows for sure. Right? But I think that is it's a very important point. I'd be prepared to argue if we had time that Machiavelli has a much better class analysis than Marx ever did. I think Marx is a dead weight around the neck of most movements today. Although I also welcome the presence of Marxists because they address important issues, but they get them all wrong. And in 9/11, the Marxists are not interested in 9/11 because they say all factors have to be purely objective. And 9/11 is subjective. And I think subjective is a big, big deal because we're human beings. Right? We act on these. There's our plan. Now, the problem with that kind of stuff is you can launch Mazzini and his cutthroat nationalism. And of course, Mazzini, I should have mentioned, he has young Italy, young Poland, young Germany. Friedrich Engels is part of his Young Germany organization. There's young England, we have that too. There's young America. Franklin Pierce, the president we mentioned before, is a member of Young America. So it's cutthroat nationalism. And what they do is you go to London and they say, here's the map of your country the way it's going to be. And they give one of these to every group, except then the groups would get together and say, wait a minute, all these claims overlap. Because it was a recipe for war. It was divide and conquer, right? Play the Italians against the French and against the Germans and all the rest of this stuff, right? The foreign office, this has always been. But then, see, the problem is these things take on a life of its own. And what if you get a super insane version of nationalism with a pretty monstrous version of Marxism, and they actually succeed? I think we can call this a Frankenstein principle. In other words, watch out what you create, because these things, under conditions of world breakdown, may indeed take off, as they did in this case. Right? Certainly, Hitlerism is difficult to imagine without the premise of Mazzini's extreme, cutthroat, racist nationalism, and of course, Stalin is explicitly based on Marx. So the two greatest achievements of the Foreign Office in the 19th century ultimately come back to haunt the world, and that may still go on. Now, if we look at the backers of Hitler, of course, we have to remember Prescott Bush. This is my research from 1992, that the seizure of power by Hitler was financed with the help of Prescott Bush from Wall Street. That is to say, the grandfather of the current tenant of the White House, illegitimate, but tenant of the White House, that's Prescott Bush. And he was sending money and weapons. He helped the Nazis win the street battles in Berlin in the late 20s and early 30s. But there are more. It's not just Prescott Bush. Here we have the wonderful architecture of Palladio, brought to us by Sir Henry Wotton. And of course, this is Clifton. Cliveden, as I always say, but Clifton. And this is, of course, Lady Astor and the Clifton set. So Lady Astor, you've got Lady Astor, Lord Astor, Lord Brand, Lord Lothian, Lord Halifax, a few others. And this is the British Hitler fan club. And it's well known. Sir Neville Chamberlain is a creature of this group. So essentially, it's the Anglo-American interest that supports Hitler's rise to power. And there is just no way around this. And the idea is they say, well, isn't this dangerous? I mean, a madman like Hitler in a big, important, powerful country like Germany? And they'd say, no, he only goes east. He's a one-way gun. We'll play him against Stalin and get rid of both of them that way. But wait a minute, what if not? So if this is one of the great deceptions. Lord Halifax, Foreign Secretary, forgot him. But how about Montague Norman of the Bank of England. When Hitler had just seized power, he needed a loan right away. And he said, let's float the loan in London, greatest capital market in the world, obviously. Except you couldn't float a loan in London if the Bank of England didn't approve you. And he did. Montague Norman approved the first Nazi loan in the first months of after Hitler had seized power, early 1933. So it meant that the immense power of the Bank of England, this colossal power with capital structures that are 300 years old, was essentially mobilized to permit Hitler to stabilize after he had taken power. Montague Norman is a fascinating subject all in himself. He's basically a one-man international monetary fund, the currency dictator of Europe, a fascinating figure. But you can see an elderly eccentric. I mean, you can go to Hyde Park Corner and find people like this mumbling today. There he is, right? But his power is absolutely immense, except if you challenge him, right? Think what he did to the Labour Party in the 1930s and so forth. Now, one other huge important feature of this, King Edward VII is undoubtedly the most successful political operative of the House of Hanover. And his masterpiece is that he created the alliance system that led to World War I. When he was beginning to take power in the early 1900s, after the death of Queen Victoria, as he said, people talk about an eternal father, but I have an eternal mother. He was the Prince of Wales for decades and decades and decades. He created this unparalleled international network. Theodore Roosevelt, Poincaré, Clemenceau, Russians, Italians, Austrians, he had it all. He created the Anglo-French Entente, he created the Anglo-Russian Entente, he created the Triple Entente, the nutcracker that encircled Germany and allowed the First World War to occur. This is his masterpiece. Now, he died, of course, before the war, but all the people who carried out the war, Edward Grey, Churchill, Jackie Fisher of the Admiralty, all kinds of people, they're all his proteges, really down to the present. So, in this context, it is during his time, as Prince of Wales and then as king, that we get the emergence of the invisible government in the United States, the Rogue Network. Now, I told you before, I'm trying to posit that the force behind the gunpowder plot is actually the Venetian Party of England. So what's the one that's doing it in the U.S. today? It is this invisible government or rogue network. And it goes back to J.P. Morgan, right? Wall Street financier. And his story is that he's the agent of the City of London in New York. During World War I, he buys all the munitions for the British and the French. Here he is talking to journalists. Charming fellow. They call him Jupiter. You can go to his mansion today. It's a library. It is the whole interior is Italian Renaissance. His hero was the banker Chigi of Florence. Now, during the era of Edward VII, and this is in the mid-1890s, you have this Venezuelan debt crisis, Barings Bank crisis beginning in the 1890s, ringing a bell. Anyway, what that leads to is a big attack on President Grover Cleveland of the U.S. This is the U.S. president. So what happens is the City of London organizes a run on the U.S. gold stock in 1895. It's a key date, 1895. And the President Cleveland capitulates to J.P. Morgan. And Morgan says, I will tell those guys in London to stop taking away the gold backing of the dollar. But you've got to issue Morgan bonds to give me a sweetheart interest rate. And it proves that Morgan is more powerful than the U.S. government. And it also proves that essentially he has seized control of the public debt and public finance of the United States. And he did. And from this time on, we can say the government you see is not the real government. The government you see is not the real government. The government that really counts is a financier network, loyal to Wall Street and to some extent to London too, but mainly to Wall Street, inside the institutions. If you want to name this faction, I suppose you could call it the Morgan, Mellon, Rockefeller, Federal Reserve faction. The Federal Reserve Bank is simply the codification and institutionalization of these power relations. Okay? So, U.S. invisible government, 1895. And then things begin to happen. What happens? 1898, this U.S. battleship is blown up in Havana Harbor to get a war between the U.S. and Spain. Right? This is the USS Maine. It's blown up. The official story is that the Spanish did it. Well, why would the Spanish do it? Later on, a study has shown in the 1950s that the explosion was inside the ship. Therefore, an inside job. This was an inside job. This launches the U.S. empire. Because the U.S. had no empire. But now they're going to get the Philippines, they're going to get various islands in the Pacific, and for a time they're going to get Cuba. Now here's this is a funny one. This is the proof they offer. So here's the Maine, and here's a Spanish mine. Now here we have the evil Spanish, right? And at this point I usually say, algunos bin Ladenitos españoles muy malos. Right? Los bin Ladenistas. So these are your little Spanish bin Ladens who are about to detonate the mine and blow up this thing. And it says, this picture fixes the responsibility to the satisfaction of the American people. Yeah, wait a minute, it's not true, it's a lie. Who cares whether they're satisfied or not? So this is the Hearst Press. And you see, this is a Hearst newspaper. This was the controlled corporate media. The Yellow Press, as it was called. Now you see, McKinley doesn't like this. President McKinley is a conservative Republican. He's not an imperialist. He says, I don't want the Philippines. It costs too much trouble. We're going to get a lot of people killed. And a lot of people did get killed. So the Hearst Press whipped up public opinion so that both houses of Congress demand from McKinley that he takes the Philippines, that he goes to war, and that he takes the Philippines. But you can see from this that he's not a good imperialist. So what are they going to do? Here's McKinley. 1897 to 1901. They kill him. Here he is getting shot twice by an anarchist, Leon Czolgosz, in Buffalo, 1901, at the Pan American Exposition. Now, the story with this is that Czolgosz is another kind of patsy. In this case, he's the Manchurian candidate. He's either somebody who's already a psychotic, or he is brainwashed to the point where he is a psychotic, and then told to go out and do these things. In these decades, the typical patsy was an anarchist. Italian anarchists were very common. Polish or Russian anarchists were equally prominent. So this guy Czolgosz, now who's behind him? Here's Czolgosz. He is a mentally disturbed recluse who comes out of the individual life, no friends, and goes and kills the President of the United States. Who's behind him? Emma Goldman, a leading anarchist. She had worked for the British against the Russian Empire in Poland, and then she was brought over to the U.S. and she set up a settlement house, and she essentially prepped Czolgosz to go and kill the President of the United States. Now the outcome of this is that Theodore Roosevelt, a determined imperialist, is going to become the U.S. president. Now how about this one? The American president who most succeeded in mastering the invisible government for his 4 terms, at least 3 plus a couple of months, is of course Franklin D. Roosevelt. And I will defend Roosevelt against various slanders against him a bit later on. But this is the attempt by the invisible government to assassinate Roosevelt before he took office. You see? Here we are on February 15th, 1933. We're approaching the very bottom of the Great Depression. Hitler has just seized power in Germany. And the question is, who's going to be president of the United States? Here he is in a motorcade in Miami with a man called Chernak, who was the mayor of Chicago. And as you can imagine, the mayor of Chicago, a very important guy in the Democratic Party. There's an attempt to kill Roosevelt. They miss Roosevelt and kill Chernak. This is not widely known. So approximately 30 years before the Kennedy assassination, there's an attempt to assassinate Roosevelt. And this shows us these are the 2 presidents who attempted to fight back against the invisible government. Roosevelt and Kennedy, they're the only positive figures we have the whole time. So one of them gets an assassination attempt, and 30 years later the other one actually gets liquidated. And again, this is a continuum. The faction doing this is the same one. It's the 9/11 faction, the September criminals, the Vietnam War faction. There's China. Killed because he was sitting behind Roosevelt. He was also a good guy. That was not the point. Now, at a certain point, we get an American war hero of World War I, General Smedley Butler, who comes forward and says, you know, they tried to kill Roosevelt. Now they're trying to organize a fascist coup. This is a very interesting story. Mussolini's March on Rome, 1922. The Morgan Group, and this is very well documented, the Morgan Group says, let's organize a march on Washington, a la Mussolini, and get rid of Roosevelt and put in a fascist dictator of the United States. This is an active plan of the Morgan Group. So this is their goal. Put somebody like this in control in Washington, D.C. And they've tried to kill Roosevelt and failed. Now they're going to try to organize a plot because the plot is discovered and it fails. Now, let's see where we are. Okay. We're practically in our present time. We're going to talk for a minute about Pearl Harbor. Now, libertarians, I think, very useful people in some ways, and we need them because they don't like war, they don't like dictatorship. But when it gets to their historical and economic analysis, they are in bad shape. And here we have the question of Roosevelt and Pearl Harbor. And the normal libertarian line is Roosevelt organized Pearl Harbor. Roosevelt took the very benign, peace-loving Japanese empire and goaded them into war with various kinds of embargoes and other treatments. And therefore, he's responsible. And, to make it even worse, he withheld the intelligence from the admirals and the generals in Pearl Harbor that would have allowed them to defend the U.S. fleet against the Japanese surprise attack. So Roosevelt is the devil incarnate. Now, this is a fantastic legend. This is a distortion. It is a monstrosity. And as a historian, I'm filled with revulsion also because politically, this is all wrong. My personal thesis is without a massive return to New Deal economic policies, there will be very little chance for human life in North America, at least over the next couple of decades. It's got to be a massive return to the New Deal. Now, there is a conspiracy. Roosevelt is the target of the conspiracy. And again, I'm begging your indulgence, but the mover of the conspiracy is Sir Winston Churchill. Now, I have to talk to you a little bit from the English-speaking world again. I had a member of my family, one of my grandmother's relatives, was in the British Army and was blown up at Gallipoli. And part of my background is that we knew that Sir Winston Churchill was a bungler and a fool because of what he did at Gallipoli that got our relative killed. He was walking along the beach, stepped on a mine, and nothing was ever found of this poor relative of mine up there in Yorkshire. And we had a picture of a pale-faced young man in the British Army uniform of the time. So when I hear neocons telling me about how great Winston Churchill is, my blood boils. And again, you can call it this Yorkshire background. This is the real face of Winston Churchill. He's testing the Thompson submachine gun. Now, what's the idea? After the fall of France, the policies of the Clifton set, Lady Astor, Lord Astor, and all the rest of it, had gotten Britain into this terrible fix. And of course, Churchill says to his alcoholic son Randolph, what are you going to do? I'll drag the United States in. It's clear enough. Right? No big mystery. And in some ways, it's understandable. I mean, in some ways, it's justifiable. But specifically the way he does it, these two people, these are both invisibles. You think you see them, but they're both invisible. This is General Marshall. He represents the invisible government. And especially Stimson. So he's the commander of the entire U.S. Army, big thing at the time. And Stimson is the head of the War Department, the Defense Department. Now, Stimson is also the ego ideal of Bush the Elder. He spoke when Bush the Elder graduated from Andover Prep School, public school. Stimson was there. So he's running the Defense Department, War Department, and he's the head of the Army. These are people who withhold the intelligence. They make sure that Roosevelt is not informed. And on the Navy side, this is the main villain of Pearl Harbor. Please make a note of him. He is Admiral Richmond K. Turner. And his function, and you can see this in various books, is that he blocked the intelligence going to Pearl Harbor. And he failed to tell the Pearl Harbor admirals and generals that they were doing the wrong thing and that they should have defended against the Japanese naval attack with aircraft carriers. The other thing is, the usual libertarian argument is Roosevelt cut off the intelligence to the Navy and the people in Pearl Harbor. It's the reverse. These forces, these two, this guy, cut off the intelligence to Roosevelt. They denied, as you see here, the purple was the Japanese diplomatic code, which the U.S. could read. Purple, Japanese diplomatic code. It tells you what they're going to do with a diplomatic code. It doesn't tell you where warships are going. It doesn't tell you. So from September 1940 to January 41, no purple for Roosevelt. And if that's not enough, from May 1941 to 12th of November 1941, 6 months, no purple. Magic, this means code intercepts. Now, there's another naval code, JN-25. This is the one you've got to know where the warships are going. This is the Japanese fleet code. It's sometimes called the 5-number code. It's the warship code. And according to any number of sources, the British Code Center in Bletchley Park. Bletchley Park can read this, and they read it from Hong Kong, from Singapore, and all these other listening posts in the Far East. So, this would tell you that there's going to be an attack on Pearl Harbor. This purple will not tell you, but JN-25 will. The U.S. Navy cannot read JN-25, right? They can read very limited number of things, like 10% of a given message. Now, we have these two interesting authors, Russ Bridger and Nave. Nave is from the Royal Australian Navy. And their thesis is, Churchill was aware that a task force had sailed from northern Japan, it was headed for Pearl Harbor, and he deliberately withheld the vital information from Roosevelt as a way of getting the U.S. into war at any cost. Roosevelt was deceived by Churchill, who took a gamble that this would bring the U.S. into war with no opposition. It did succeed in that, but it lost the British Empire in the process. Okay, so that, I think, is at least a sketch of Pearl Harbor. There'd be much more to say about this. I'm collapsing a 2-hour Guy Fawkes and a 2-hour Pearl Harbor into this to spare you. Now we're almost, I've gotten special requests from a number of people to talk about Italian terrorism. And I think we have some people here who are authorities here tonight. I was over there in Italy in the late 70s. This is 1978. And you have the kidnapping and murder of Aldo Moro, who was at that point the former prime minister and a leader of the Christian Democratic Party. Here he is assassinated. Now, Moro's plan was so-called historical compromise, and what he wanted to do is to say, instead of having coalition governments that are constantly shifting with lots of little parties, let's bring the Communist Party into the government with the Christian Democrats to have a big, stable majority so we can carry out needed reforms and progress and have a stronger country. The Communist Party, of course, by this time is not a communist party. It's simply a social democratic party with a labor base and nothing really much communist about it. They were called Comunisti all'acqua di rosa. There's rosewater communists or pink communists, right? Very diluted. And his partner in this is the head of the Italian Communist Party, Berlusconi. So these two together, and they're also responding to the attack, Kissinger's coup in Chile in the early 70s. They're trying to make sure that doesn't happen in their country. So they want to have a strong national government. These are nationalists, and this is a wonderful thing to be. However, Kissinger, based on pure hysteria, says, no. Why is that? He says, well, we have the Yalta line of demarcation. The Yalta line of demarcation says no communist role in the government anywhere west of the line. This is why some terrorism, and 9/11 is an example, can be described as spheres of influence or geopolitical terrorism. This is an example. He's saying, if Italy goes to the communists, we lose the whole Mediterranean, and then Europe is lost. Because that's one way you lose Europe. As you lose the Mediterranean, it's gone. So the big conflict then that emerges is between Kissinger and Moro. And after my book was published, and after Moro, and of course all the rest of it had calmed down, the widow of Moro came forward and said, a very high-level American threatened my husband and said that if you don't watch out, you will have a very bad end. So I recommend that you stop doing what you're doing, Signor Moro. Signor Moro. Now, I was approached in this the summer of 1978 by a former member of the Italian government. This is what he looks like today. Giuseppe Zamberletti. He had been Deputy Interior Minister for Secret Services. And he said, why don't you write a story, do a longer article about the media and the Moro assassination. And I got a bunch of friends together. We went to Wiesbaden, Germany, spent our summer vacation. We came out with a book, which is the one I showed you before. And again, the thesis is NATO intelligence is behind this. Not the Warsaw Pact, not some communist organization called the Red Brigades, or anything else. And here we are in Milan, the 1st of May, 1978. Sorry about the French, this was my Montreal show a couple of weeks ago. Kissinger and Gardner kidnapped Moro, it says. Kissinger, Gardner, the U.S. ambassador, they kidnapped Moro. This was during the time before he was killed, because he was kept as a prisoner for a couple of months. And of course, we can't forget Licio Gelli, the Grande Maestro of the P2 Lodge, which was Mazzini, under British auspices, had created Propaganda 1. Under U.S. auspices, now they create Propaganda 2. So he's the Grande Maestro of that lodge, which is the center for organizing the background and the build-up for this. And I've also been asked to say a couple of words about Gladio. Gladio is simply this. It's a stay-behind organization. In other words, they said, well, what if the Red Army comes and the Soviets take over Italy? We've got to organize guerrilla warfare. So they created a network of guerrilla fighters whose goal would have been terrorism under the Warsaw Pact occupation, and arms and explosives and equipment and thousands of people, and the whole thing was completely secret. And I went through all of this. Gladio did not become known for almost 22, 23 years after this. The P2 Lodge became known about 3 years after this. But in this book, we basically have it all except for the names. Gladio was created by Lyman Lemnitzer, who had done Operation Northwoods on the U.S. side. He then became the NATO commander, and in about the middle of the 1960s, they began creating these deposits of weapons and explosives. Now, we're getting towards the end, so thank you for your valued attention. And you'll be rewarded now with 9/11. Let's just look, first of all, at the obvious absurdities, contradictions, impossibilities, and related issues of the official version, okay? Because they told me that some people come in and they don't know anything. I figured, again, this would be the most sophisticated audience in the world. I think it probably is here in London. But let's just go through this in case people have just come in off the street. Sorry. So, this, of course, is it. Now, what do you call this? The collapse of the building? This is a building exploding. It's being pulverized. It's being destroyed in midair. And you've got debris being thrown out hundreds of yards straight up. It's obviously a very violent process. And remember, in the middle of all this, you have these tremendously strong columns, which are the structure of a suspension bridge, a battleship. They're extremely strong steel. And they're tapered, they're very thick at the bottom, slightly less so at the top. And it's a heat sink. In other words, if you apply tremendous heat to any one point of this structure, the effect of the steel is to convoy that heat away. You have to heat the whole thing up. And you know that you don't, with a kerosene fire based on jet fuel, you don't get anywhere near the temperatures you would need to determine the fall of these buildings. And instead, what we get is this molten metal, right? You can see it. It's metal that has been liquefied by what must be a tremendous heat source. And you can see it again. The molten metal is pouring out of the side of the building. Now, could a kerosene fire do that? Have you ever had a kerosene stove and liquefied a steel pot or a steel pan? Have you ever had a gasoline motor that melted? I think not. But in this case, we're told, and they said, well, that's the aluminum from the airplane, and it turns out not to be. Now, here's one of the typical detritus of 9/11. Now, that's one of the pillars. That's one of those 45 or so columns on the inside of the building. And you look at this. Does that look like that was done by a fire? It looks like it was done by an oxyacetylene blowtorch in the hands of a very skilled craftsman, but it's probably not that. It's the result of controlled demolition. Now, this kind of picture is what Rudy Giuliani didn't want. Rudy Giuliani banned all pictures at the scene, the ground zero. And he then carted off every piece of steel to melt it down so you couldn't get a picture like this, and you couldn't go and analyze what's in this molten metal, because it turns out, of course, to be thermate. It turns out to be this chemical compound which creates a very, very high degree of heat and can indeed produce the heat temperatures that are needed. So that's the Twin Towers in a nutshell. The Pentagon, of course, is we're told that it's a Boeing that's hitting the wall of the Pentagon. Well, it would be something like this, according to the official story. And of course, you've got to imagine one of these basket case characters, Hani Hanjour in this case, he's somebody who couldn't get a license for a small plane, a Piper Cub or a Cessna. Nobody would rent him one because they wouldn't trust him. He's probably somebody who couldn't get a driver's license in most American states, with the possible exception of New Jersey. And nevertheless, we're told that he can equal the Red Baron in his ability, because he can come down to 270-degree turn, and then he flies at about 2 centimeters off this turf, which is not singed by the jet exhaust. So this is quite a feat. And again, many airline pilots have looked at this and said, even with my 15,000 hours, I can't do it. Masson, the French leader of our international movement, Thierry Masson, put this out within a couple of weeks, pointing out, how do you get a 38-meter wingspan into a 19-meter hole? And this is after the facade collapsed. Because at the beginning, the hole is much smaller, and then more of it collapses as a result not of the impact, but of the fire. And that's where the Boeing went. The Boeing disappeared into that hole, says the U.S. government to you, and you're expected to believe that. This is a real prison house in the mind. The Boeing went in there. Now, there are certain die-hard supporters of the, in this case, of the official version, who say, yeah, but there's a bigger hole down here. The water is covering up the real big hole. And again, you can see how big is that. And the entire wall above it is intact. So the Boeing went in there. You expected to. I hope you don't, because it didn't. This is obviously a cruise missile. It's obviously something with a shaped charge, an armor piece and warhead or something like this. Here we are in Shanksville. And again, the problem here is, where's the plane? You don't find a plane. They say that the airplane went into that crater. Well, fine, dig it up and reassemble it. They can dig it up they bring it up from the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean, from TWA 800. Where's the plane? The plane is either not there, or it has been destroyed at a much higher altitude by some very powerful agency that has scattered the small pieces over a large area. But even that is extremely unlikely. So we're left with a real puzzle. What is with the Shanksville aircraft? And there's another version. The Boeing went in there. They say there's an abandoned mine underneath. Well, where's the plane? Everybody has a favorite Achilles heel. I mean, this is a story with so many Achilles heels. It's difficult to know where to begin. I was just listening to a guy on the radio the other day. He said this is his favorite story. Where's the plane? As he said in his New York accent. And this is the great Achilles heel is, of course, Building 7, the one that they don't tell you about, which collapses at 5:30 in the afternoon, even though it has been hit by no aircraft, and the fires involved are very small, and its fall is perfectly symmetrical. It doesn't tilt towards the wreckage of the buildings. And of course, you all know the embarrassing moment for the BBC, where the charming lady from the BBC tells you that the Salomon Brothers building close to the World Trade Center has collapsed, Building 7, except the poor lady, we look over her shoulder, and there's Building 7, and it hasn't collapsed. And it won't collapse for another 22 minutes. So how did they know in advance that it's going to collapse, unless it's controlled demolition, which it obviously is. And of course, the BBC is not the only one. There are others who also... I was in Berlin, Germany that day, and the German television was saying the building was going to collapse. CNN said it was going to collapse. Okay. Here are the two towers. Here's the South Tower. Here's the North Tower. Here's Building 7. Here's Building 6. This is an interesting story. Where did we get this huge crater blown in the roof of Building 6? That's another story in itself. But notice that Building 7 is separated from the main complex by a street. This is called Vesey Street here in Lower Manhattan. And there's no way that debris which did not destroy this building is going to go across and destroy this one. And in any case, that would have then tipped it towards the side of the debris. Instead, we don't have that. The other interesting effect here is the molten metal, which remained in pools in the sub-basement for weeks after the event. And of course, there is no way that this could have been generated by jet fuel. But the evidence that interests me now as we move towards the conclusion, I'm interested in the political evidence. Other people do more with the technical evidence than I do, but nobody seems to be interested in the main technical evidence. These are two things. One is the ultimatum of the coup faction to Bush. And secondly, the fact that you have 25 plus drills going on. Bear with me. Here's Bush in Sarasota at the Hooker Elementary School, and he's in the 5th grade reading class with the teacher, and they're going to do My Pet Goat. He doesn't read My Pet Goat, by the way. The children read My Pet Goat to him. It's important to defend but we have to keep it straight. Okay, 9:03 a.m., the second plane hits the South Tower. Now, under any normal circumstances, this means that something is going on. The Secret Service is supposed to pick him up, carry him out, take him to a secret bunker location. They can't leave him in the school where everybody knows that he's there. It's like saying, anybody got any assets, why don't you have a go at it? He's basically being offered, he's hung out to dry, and hung out as a target for the coup faction to take a pass at. They had options that day. Keep Bush in power as a puppet, liquidate Bush and have Cheney, or have a committee of public safety. They had that one too, and they had that there. Now this is the moment when he's told the U.S. is under attack. Now I was up in Vancouver in Canada a couple of months ago, and Gillian Norman is actually from Yorkshire, so she's part of the Yorkshire School along with me. She is a great Australian documentary filmmaker. They're going to be launching her film Shadow Play in February, March. If you want to escape from the winter in the Northern Hemisphere, go to Australia next February and March, and you can have a kind of a road show from Perth to Melbourne to Sydney to essentially the very warm area north of Sydney, a beautiful area. They're going to have all this stuff. So anyway, she said, what she thinks Card is saying is Angel is next. In any case, Angel is next is the threat that arrives at the Secret Service sometime between 9 and 10 o'clock in the morning, meaning Air Force One is next. Angel meaning Air Force One. This warning comes with a series of top-secret code-level code words from across the entire top of the U.S. government, from the CIA, from the Pentagon, the NSA, the DIA, and all the rest. In other words, the people issuing this threat are the top of the U.S. government in terms of permanent bureaucracy and other operatives. And it is an ultimatum to Bush saying, you must now launch the war of civilizations by attacking Afghanistan, by saying terrorism, by saying Bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. And if you don't do it in conventional form, we have code words, we can do it in nuclear form. We have the code words necessary to launch nuclear missiles, and don't you forget it. Now, I have a debate with the Canadian authority, Barry's Ricker, about what is this man thinking. And Barry's version is something like this. My plan is working. I will conquer the world. I will sweep aside all opposition, and I will wage the war of civilization. That's more or less his version. That this is the complacent face of a man whose evil plan is coming to fruition beyond his wildest dreams. My version is a little bit, it's not so nice. You know the adult undergarments for incontinence? He's saying, I should have worn the pens, because he's just had an accident when he's told this. In other words, I see here the face of fear. I see fear. I see terror. He doesn't know what to do next. And his friend Ari Fleischer is holding up a big sign saying, don't say anything. He's glad not to say anything. Now, he sits there then for 10 to 15 minutes listening to My Pet Goat. And again, one of the first persons you want to subpoena is the head of the Secret Service. Why did your men not take him out of the room to a bunker? There's one person in his entourage who says, we're out of here. It's reported to be a Secret Service agent or the Marine who's carrying the football, the nuclear launch codes. But just the fact that he's sitting there is already an unbelievable violation of all the possible rules. And you really want to go after the Secret Service because you have to assume they're part of the coup. Because this is a coup. A coup, of course, is when one part of the government carries out a violent attack on another part of the government and people can die. And they do die. And in this case, they did die. Now look, he's talking from the school. The clock back here, you can't see it on my slide because of my technical problem. My Ford Foundation grant didn't come through for these slides. But it's 9:25. So it's the first plane hits at about 8:45. So this is now what, this is 40 minutes after the first impact and 22 minutes after the second impact. And he's still in the school. He's still in the school. And now, at 9:29, which is now 34 minutes after the first impact and 26 minutes after the second, he's going to give a speech in the school with television. And this is where he says, freedom itself was attacked. And he does say terrorism this time. Now he's leaving Sarasota. And he's departing Sarasota. Now the interesting thing is, he has no fighter escort. The whole U.S. Air Force cannot spare 2 F-15s or F-16s to escort the presidential plane. He is denuded. And it's at this point that he gets the threat, Angel is next. And if you read my book, as I hope you do, he's getting messages saying, kamikaze aircraft are approaching you, they're going to crash into you. He said, your home in Crawford, Texas is under attack, he's told. And here's where he goes. He starts in Sarasota, right? And he could have gone to any of these other Air Force bases. Here's Homestead, that's probably the closest. There are others. But instead he goes to Barksdale, Louisiana. Why is that? Barksdale is the #2 thermonuclear warfighting headquarters. It is the home of the Night Watch Looking Glass Doomsday aircraft, flying command centers designed to stay up for 2 weeks at most, refueled in the air, to fight a thermonuclear war. Now the hypothesis here has always been he has to go there to establish his control of the nuclear weapons, because the faction that has attempted to seize control of the government could launch the missiles unless he's actually on the scene somewhere saying, no, I'm the president and I did not issue that order. So he goes there first, and he goes then to Nebraska. This is the old headquarters of the Strategic Air Command. Why does he go there? That's the #1 thermonuclear warfighting base. And there he goes into the bunker system. So the 2 places he goes are both the top, the number 2 and then the #1 thermonuclear warfighting base. And again, the idea is to assert that he's in control of the nuclear forces. Now this is after approximately 2 hours on the way from Sarasota to Barksdale, I believe. He finally gets fighter escort. After 2 hours, there's no fighter escort, and he finally gets it. And at the beginning, the pilot of his plane refuses to tell the escorts where they're going. He just says, follow me, I'm not telling you where we're going. So they don't trust him. Because they don't know, of course, the Air Force is heavily involved in the coup. Now here he is at Barksdale, talking to Air Force personnel. He gives a speech at Barksdale. The word terrorism has disappeared from the speech. He doesn't say terrorism at all. Nassau's pointed out. And finally, when he gets to Nebraska, he goes into the bunker. He is an expendable puppet, an expendable asset, fighting for survival. Because again, he's told, you do what we say, or we will find another way to get along. From Offa, he engages in negotiations. I call these negotiations. This is supposed to be a teleconference with people at the Pentagon and elsewhere. But to me, this is a process of negotiation between officers who are essentially speaking for the crew and the president who is fighting for his life. So, of course, he is a villain. He eagerly capitulates. He eagerly offers himself. There's no resistance as far as I can see. He then capitulates. Here's the other end. This is the Pentagon Command Center where some of those people at the other end of the line would have been. And this is the moment now. It's about 8 o'clock in the evening. He's back in the White House and he says, we will make no distinction between those countries that harbor terrorism and the terrorists themselves, so choose sides, you world. And that is the declaration of the War of Civilizations. That's what the World Network wanted. In the bunker here, with Bush, Richard Clarke. This is the meeting where Clarke says, okay, we're going to do a pro forma investigation. We all know it was bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, don't we? Because you don't. You don't know that. And they've never proved it. The entire commission, like the Kane Hamilton Commission, is an exercise in begging the question. In other words, you don't prove what you're supposed to prove. You assume it's true, and then you take it from there. So, impeach for treason. Now let's just look into the other side briefly, which is the drills. Here we are in Norway, right? North American Air Defense Command under this big Cheyenne Mountain, Boulder, Colorado, and this is the air defense. General that day is a Canadian. There's an alternates, right? One day U.S., one day Canadian. And in particular, we want to look at the Northeast Air Defense Sector, Griffiths Air Force Base, Rome, New York. And they're looking at the screens. General Larry Arnold is an important guy. We saw miners before. There are one or two others. And here's Colonel Maw. Remember him? He's the guy who couldn't launch his aircraft. Well, what they do launch, what they have launched, is they have a special AWACS over Washington and an AWACS over Florida where Bush is. And this is done by Larry Arnold on his own initiative to say, let's have a little drill. Well, that would be an obvious thing if you wanted to have a coup, because you want to control Washington and you want to control where the president is. Those are your two main concerns. So they do all that. And now this is the heart of my research, which, because of Guy Fawkes, I do not put in the center of attention tonight, which I have in the past and do in my book and will again. On 9/11, you have the greatest density of military drills, military exercises in the entire history of the United States, by far. 25 plus drills. Either going on that day, recently concluded, say in about the 2 or 3 months before, or in the advanced stages of planning for soon after. And this includes, let me just run through a couple of them, just take a minute or two. You have about a dozen air drills, which take most of the fighters that would have been between Boston and New York, and it sends them to Alaska, Northern Canada, Iceland, and Saudi Arabia and Turkey, intrally, for the illegal unilateral no-fly zone of northern and southern Iraq. So even here, the assets you needed for defense were Iraq. The reason they do this is because if there are lots of planes, somebody might respond. It's easier to be sure that nobody will respond. Because again, it's not the whole Air Force doing this. It's only a selected network of people that they can rely on. Like, I think Colonel Maw might be in that category, but don't quote me. So you've got all of that. And of course, they are running hijack drills. There are hijack drills planned that day. We have the tapes from Needs, and one of them says, wait a minute, something's wrong. The hijacking is not supposed to be for another hour. The hijacking is not supposed to be for another hour. Now, that, of course, makes us think that if the 19 patsies were there at all, which there's no proof, if the patsies were there, they were probably there thinking that they were paid actors in a drill. In other words, they were double agents who were told, guys, you know, you can make $500 by playing Middle East terrorists, right? You guys look the part. You're straight from central casting, right? You're dark skinned and all the rest of it. You really look like a terrorist. Come and make some money, and you go home that night. All the evidence is that the patsies thought they were going home that that night. And again, if this is any guide, it shows that I think some of the people involved here in the 7/7 in London, the guys who made the films, are people who think they're going to make 200 quid and then go home, and they think they're making a training video. They think they're making something that's a part of the drill that they're in. And this explains a lot of conduct which you can't explain otherwise. Okay, Amalgam Virgo. Amalgam Virgo, I think, is the Pentagon. Amalgam Virgo is firing a cruise missile from a barge or a ship in the Atlantic or in the Gulf of Mexico and hitting a land target. Of course, you can launch a cruise missile from the air, from the land, from the water, from underwater. You can do that too. I think that's what hit the Pentagon. Then we have National Reconnaissance Office, NRO. The scenario, planes crash into skyscrapers. Well, again, the principle of all this is, if the scenario of the drill that's going on at more or less the same time comes true, it means that the drill has been flipped live, taken live, the drill has become real with a small change, and that's how the effect was produced. New York City is running this REDX drill. See it there? REDX. That's a New York State one. New York City, sorry. Scenario of the drill, planes crash into buildings, buildings collapse. And again, I would always say that the planes were under the control of Global Hawk, the well-known U.S. Air Force remote control technology. And they did this down to a very, very minute level, which is this one here. The Department of Transportation cell phone exercise. You remember, in the first days and weeks, the main way in which the validity of this story was sold to common people, to the masses of the world, was through the cell phone. The heart-rending pathos of a doomed husband and a doomed wife talking to their spouse or their children, right? I love you, I know I'm going to die, and all this. It would seem to me, given the many, many technical problems with doing this, we have Professor Dutney of Canada, who has written about this issue extensively, that these cell phones were cynically generated according to an apparatus that was set up and tested in this cell phone drill, which took place at the end of August of 2001, so a couple of weeks before the actual events. We have a drill here at Shanksville, Pennsylvania, mall strike, plane crashing into the ground. But of course you could say, well, such drills are going on everywhere. Okay, but here's the thing, this is where we have to say goodbye, William Vaca. You can argue with every one of these. You can say, wait a minute, on that one there's something wrong, or you can't say that because this one has a certain departure. But I'm not asking you to look at the details anymore now. Look at that pattern. How can you have a pattern of 25 plus drills? And I could, if I wanted to inflate this, I could probably get it up to almost 35 if I really wanted to go for broke in the hiking of this stuff. How can you explain this pattern which is chronologically congruent with the event, or before or after? Again, there's always that. But when you have a drill, you create an apparatus which remains, or when you're about to do the drill, you also have the apparatus, so that would fall into place there. This pattern is the proof. Right? They told me in Italy, get ready, because people are going to say, you have proof? Yeah, I have proof. I have 25 plus drills that cover every aspect of the observed phenomenon. Every meme of the myth is located here. And this includes, by the way, the attack on Afghanistan is drilled in advance. We have one other drill. Computer experts are told to come to the World Trade Center that morning, I think, so that they're going to get killed. So they're going to be liquidated. In other words, some people who really knew too much are told to come to the attack site that morning. And that's the end of that. Again, the NRO. And now finally, the scariest one of all. You see this one here, Global Guardian? Global Guardian? That's thermonuclear warfare. That's an Armageddon drill. It means that B-52s, quite possibly loaded, B-1s, ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles are all ready to go. I met General Ivashov of the Russian forces. Ivashov was commanding in Moscow that day. Ivashov says, before any plane was hijacked, we saw a mobilization comparable to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And why would they do that? Well, let's see. The centerpiece of the day from a world strategic point of view is the Bush-Putin telephone call. And Putin calls to offer his support because he can see that the madmen have taken power, the neocon fascist madmen rule Washington, D.C., and he's got to do something about that. So he takes a flexible approach. Now, Bush says to him, guess what? We're taking Afghanistan, and we're going to seize bases in the 5 Soviet republics of Central Asia. Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, some of the others. It's not clear which ones. Now, think of it. The Soviets fought for 10 years, and look at all they lost to keep Afghanistan neutral. Suppose I'm a sort of a Red Army bullet head, and Bush says to me, guess what, we're going to take Afghanistan. You know what I could say? Nyat! I'll blow your head off. Don't you dare. But Putin doesn't say that. He says, please, go ahead. Afghanistan is yours. Go there, you'll see what you find. We know what you'll find. You'll find it too. The British found it, the Russians found it, now the US is finding it. So he chooses a flexible response. He's also thinking, under neocon control, the US will get weaker, they'll attack more countries, they'll become hated, isolated, internal dissent, weaken the armed forces, scatter themselves, divide their forces all over the world. Russia will get stronger, oil income, new missiles, research, recovery will be stronger, they'll be weaker. We'll take it. That's what he's thinking. So this is this honeymoon between Bush and Putin. And of course, I have to say, the British campaign against Putin has made the chickens laugh around the world by what they've done about these recent cases, but not convinced anybody. Now, in terms of the method, I do want to say a couple of words about 7th of July 2005 in London, because it's the same thing. Everybody knows the Peter Power Visor Consultants, where he says, we were holding simulations of bombs in those stations more or less at more or less those times. And he says that at the BBC. But what we don't seem to know, even very well informed ones, is that there are 3 big drills going on at this time, or actually they have taken place about 2 to 3 months earlier. Tony Blair even mentions them in public. They are Atlantic Blue of the British, Top-Off 3 of the US, and Triple Play of Canada. And the scenario of these is the same. It is bombs in the London Underground at the same time that you have an important international conference going on in the British Isles, which is the Gleneagles G7. So there it is. Those drills were run, the structures were created, and I'm afraid the working hypothesis would have to be that the effects are generated through the apparatus thus prepared. The drills went live. This is the symbol of amalgam Verga. This is where it gets really heavy-handed. Look. It's June of 01. It's a couple of months before the fact. And they put Bin Laden's face on the handbook for the drill. How about this one? Here's one where they start. They start in Alaska. They cross Canadian airspace yet. And an airplane goes to crash into the Capitol. So I think they're trying to say that they want to crash an airplane into the Capitol, right? And again, watch out. Everybody participates. Don't get caught outside of the coup, or it won't go well for you. And of course, the big thing is the Global Guardian. On this morning, we have bombers flying around, presumably loaded. This never came out. And we have missiles, and we have the entire thing. And the point of this is that they want to show this to Putin to say, we are prepared to go to the limit of nuclear war today. If you try to keep us out of Afghanistan and prevent us from executing this strategy of the war of civilization. And I think this is absolutely critical. And this is, again, where Putin has actually, by his flexibility in this case, he avoided a possible thermonuclear confrontation. That he could just as easily say, look, your dog and pony show, this idiotic spectacle that you people have put on, your own goal, because that's what it is. So you score an own goal. What do you want from me? Take your own goal and leave Afghanistan. But he doesn't do that. He's flexible. He would have made himself caudillo in the model of Franco for another 30 years of dictatorship if some institutional resistance, possibly involving the king, I don't know about that, but what I know for sure is that 1/3 of the Spanish population went into the streets and said, no, we will not have dictatorship, we're sick of terrorism, We don't want it. And they correctly said the reason for this is somehow connected to the war with Iraq. It is, in a certain way, quite close to connected. Of course, it's NATO intelligence. It's not being done by patsies, it's being done by NATO intelligence. 1/3 of the Spanish population, 1/3 went into the streets. 2 million in Madrid. Now, of course, we represent the phlegmatic Anglo-Saxon part of the world, and we are politically backward. I'm sorry. If Spain can do that, I've seen general strikes in Italy. They have them a lot. There's a movement in the U.S. which I think has merit, which is to at least propagandize the idea that if there is an illegal, illegitimate war, especially one predicated on a new 9/11 or a new fake Gulf of Tonkin, because those are the two choices with the road B-52, that this is the only answer. In other words, go into the streets and say no. Have a demonstration, some kind of mass action, shut down the machine and protest and do it vociferously. And maybe you'll be able to change public opinion. Because if there is an attack on Iran, there will be a huge campaign of demonization and, of course, war psychosis coming out of the controlled media. So I recommend that people have a Spanish response to whatever is coming, if it does come, and that can also then be factored in to the ruling elite, the September criminals, that is to say, and to try to convince them not to do this. In other words, try to tell them that they're going to have mass resistance. I would also cite the Kapp Putsch in Berlin back in 1920, when there was an attempted quasi-fascist coup d'etat that was stopped by a similar kind of mass strike, and so forth. It's the only way to go, and there are other examples, so I recommend a Spanish response. The impeachment of Bush it's obviously urgent. On Tuesday, Congressman Kucinich, who has at least done something, Congressman Kucinich is going to try to put through the impeachment of Cheney tomorrow, U.S. time. I urge you to support it, talk it up, tell people about it. Call in if you have radio call-ins. Do you have radio call-ins? Or you can call in and comment. Talk about it. Say that, look, there's 75% of the people in the U.S. are against the war. More than half want to get rid of Bush and Cheney. And it's simply unimaginable that these people should remain in office. If you don't impeach them, all their precedents will be valid. Every signing statement, every liberticide law that they've ran through, you've got to overturn the entire body of precedents of the Bush administration by impeaching. Therefore, it's valid to impeach them up to the last day in office for that effect. And above all, I recommend impeachment as war avoidance. In other words, if you don't want World War III, impeachment is the answer. And again, for people in other countries, why isn't the U.S. ambassador called in to explain the rogue B-52 case, the 6 dead, the missing cruise missile? Everybody indicates that those missiles were going to join the Israeli attack on Syria and or Iran on September 6th. So we've just had a brush with World War III. We had a brush with World War III at the end of March, beginning of April. We've just had another brush. Call in the U.S. ambassador. Why are you in NATO? Why are you going to allow yourself to be dragged into this? It just makes no sense. And finally, I recommend, for all of these points, if it wasn't clear, I did the best I could, but please take a look at 9/11 synthetic terror. With that, I thank you and will open the floor.